Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Martina and I'm from Denver in Colorado, which is situated on the high plains of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. My ancestors emigrated to Denver from Mexico in the 1900s along the routes of the old railway lines, and we have lived here ever since and never looked back. My family still upholds many of our traditions and embraces our ancient culture, along with our long drawn-out love affair with the chili pepper that brings to life some of our famous traditional dishes, from chili con carne to tacos, salsas, wraps, and so many other dishes with names you may find difficult to pronounce if you're not Mexican, so I'll save you the bother. My strange incredulous story that ultimately led to my anomalous Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when I was 18 years old at the time. It all began when my mother and I rented out a small apartment in Snowmass Village during the winter months, which is about 15 minutes commute to Aspen. For the both of us, this was a quintessential opportunity to raise more money for our ever-increasing family, as now both my two older cousins were expecting babies in the spring. We had been recruited for a cleaning job which involved housekeeping and straightening up some luxury cabins hired by wealthy, affluent people. These are regular, opulent, prosperous visitors who tend to frequent Aspen during the winter months to embrace the fabulous, arresting and indelible skiing opportunities and, of course, other exhilarating experiences Aspen has to offer, of which there are many, including fabulous fine dining, high-end shopping at some of the most exquisite boutiques you've ever seen, or driving to Independence Pass, or even visiting a ghost town. Believe me, there is so much to do in this part of the world, which is steeped in a vibrant, rich cultural history and is blessed with an idyllic setting and a perfect climate. It's difficult to leave Aspen without being touched magically in some way by the place, as it is a very profound, memorable way of rubbing off on you, as it is such a spectacularly awesome place. Aspen is nestled in the heart of the Rocky Mountains at 8,000 feet, so you'll find snow in Aspen half the year round. Hence the reason that you'll also find 4 ski resorts there. Words fail me to describe to you how breathtakingly beautiful it is in this part of the world, and the winters are dramatic, wondrous and awe-inspiring, and the views of the majestic Maroon Bells, the most photographed peaks in North America, are utterly stupendous. I was born and raised in Denver and grew up here with the rest of my extended family in what I can only describe as a modest, very bog-standard looking home. But it served our most immediate needs, and it still does, although space was in scant supply, and our tiny yard leaves much to be desired. But we're fortunate enough to live next to green parks, hiking trails, and vast open spaces, so I can't really complain about all of that. I live under the confines of one roof with my aunt's family, along with her 4 children, and my parents, along with 6 of my rather rambunctious, noisy younger sisters and brothers. So as you can imagine, it's a tight squeeze for all of us, but a very jovial, happy household nevertheless, which I wouldn't change for the world. Growing up as a young girl in Denver, life was never easy for me. and for many long years my life was incongruously cloaked with a dark veil of desperate unhappiness, which was exceedingly strange, because I had nothing to be sad about, as love was never in short supply in our household. Yet I felt this ineffable deep-rooted sadness that was so distressing and soul-destroying for me, that I would seek relief from my tortured state by cutting myself. I know it sounds incredibly crazy and incongruous to the uninitiated, but it would seem that when I cut myself with a sharp blade and watched the bright crimson-red blood gushing out of my wound, I would feel this incredible sense of relief. It was like I could breathe again. It all made me feel alive inside my heart that always seemed to feel so dead, lifeless and empty, almost as if my life was devoid of any purpose or meaning. Before long I had so many scars on my arms and legs from all my cutting. I was deeply ashamed of this deep, dark, insidious secret that I kept well hidden from my family under emotional lock and key. A skeleton in my cupboard that I hoped would never ever be uncovered. That was until one fateful day when I forgot to lock the bathroom door behind me. That was when my mother walked in on me, catching me in the act of cutting myself, and she nearly did her nut. I've never seen her so distraught or dismayed in all my life. The expression on her face I will never forget. She was mortified. I remember her grabbing my blade from me and screaming, "What on earth are you doing to yourself, girl?" My mother immediately sent me to a top psychologist and worked double shifts to pay for my extremely expensive medical bills. And that was when I ultimately received all the psychological help, guidance and evaluations that I actually needed, that changed my life dramatically, so much for the better. I was to learn that the root cause of my inscrutable distress and enigmatic grief was due to the very fact that I was part of an identical twin. A year after our births, my twin sister Emma died of SIDS at 1 year of age. Both my parents kept this fact a classified secret from me. They falsely assumed it was best that I was never informed about her, as it could potentially cause me anguish and heartbreak. Growing up, I'd sensed that something intrinsically wrong and ambiguous was missing from my life, which was why I was so unhinged and deeply troubled. Once I discovered that I was part of a twin, it explained away the hollow vacuum that had compounded my life for so very long. I began to heal remarkably quickly, and I felt as light and as free as a butterfly that was emerging from a cocoon to embrace a bright, cheerful and happy world. I ascertained that on a deeply subliminal level I had clearly missed my twin's absence in my life. At last the perplexing, indecipherable mystery had been brought out into the light of day, and the dark clouds had dissipated like the vapour from a steaming kettle. It was wonderful to be alive, and for the very first time in ages, I was extremely happy. My psychologist informed me that cutting is indeed a secret condition suffered by many in deep silence, and used as a coping mechanism around the world, much like some people might use drugs, foods, alcohol, or even cigarettes, to cope with something very stressful, and that did make me feel a lot better about what I'd done. We had never been a wealthy family by any manner of means, but we've always been a devoted, close and loving one. We've often struggled to get by financially because things can get tight from time to time, with so many hungry mouths to feed. This is why my mother and I accepted the job to come up to Aspen to make extra money during the winter season. We were assured by our employers that the job was rarely worthwhile, as some of these affluent families do tip very generously, and it was an added incentive for us over and above our pay packet. Well, that's what they told us anyway. My incredulous story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when my mother and I had been recruited as a joint team to clean out 2 cabins together, one that was the furthest away on the resort, flanked by a heavily wooded area of exquisitely beautiful quaking aspen trees with shimmering foliage and big-toothed aspens that during winter are cloaked with veils of white snow that hang from the trees like ethereal ice crystals and are really exquisite. We had spent the first 2 days in Aspen being fully trained by a member of staff on how to ensure that we turned out the cabins meticulously and that there was no dust anywhere. So began our cleaning adventure, and it most certainly was exactly that. It was also an education and an eye-opening experience to see how the other half live, when money has never been an issue in their lives. In all my life, I've never seen so many designer handbags, shoes, expensive clothes, and luxury perfumes and makeups. But at the end of the day, that is all they were, just things. And I soon realised that with or without money, they really were not much different to any of us. One day as my mother and I were making the bed in one of the cabins, in my peripheral vision, I was certain I'd seen something standing at the window, looking in at us with a nose smudged against the pane. I looked up for a brief moment, and I saw this very large face and these big, soulful, dark, curious eyes studying us. This was the window that was situated only yards away from the densely forested area of quaking aspen. It happened so quickly. 1 minute he was there, and then he was gone. And sometimes when things happen that fast, you begin to perceive that you must have imagined things. I was almost sure that I had. "Did you see that, Mum?" I asked. "Did I see what?" she asked. "That strange face staring at us through the window. It was black and hairy." "Oh, it was probably a bear," said my mother. "I don't think it was a bear," I told her. "It was something else." I remember that day with crystal clear clarity, as for over 2 weeks of cleaning this particular cabin, an area of the bathroom floor close to the toilet seat had been wiped down scantily, failing to conceal the telltale trails of bloody residue that looked ominously like the crime scene after I cut myself in secret when I was going through such a challenging, tumultuous, turbulent time in my own life. I also noticed a tight knotted plastic bag hidden in the bathroom bin. Every day for 2 whole weeks I had discovered it was full of tissues covered in blood. I immediately suspected that one of our guests was a secret cutter like I had been, and this was confirmed when I saw some blood-covered blades hidden in the lady's bedside table, along with lots of plasters and bandages. It was a scene that haunted me and brought back so many horrific, horrible memories of a time when I began cutting myself. I was so certain that this lady was suffering as much heartache as I had been, and I wanted more than anything in the entire world to help her. I knew that she was stinking rich, and I was exceedingly poor, but in the huge scheme of things, we weren't really much different between each other. I wrestled with my conscience. Should I pretend not to have seen what I had already discerned? Would it not be like walking past someone collapsing in a supermarket and doing nothing to help them? It seemed so morally wrong to me. I had no idea what I should do. It really was a conundrum. "Look, Mum," I said, showing her the bloody blades. "I think we have a secret cutter here. I wish I could help her." "Darling, it's none of our business. We're only here to clean, not to interfere in other people's lives. We could potentially lose our jobs if we began meddling in other people's affairs. And believe me, darling, they would not thank us for it either. No one likes their secrets being brought out into the light for everyone to see and to judge. You didn't." I knew I could never get my mother to understand the true gravity of the problem. She did not relate or even conceive the hopeless despair that I went through that time that I was cutting myself for so many years, and how tortuous it had been for me. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing to help, but I had no idea what course of action to take, so I prayed about it earnestly, asking for guidance and direction. I even asked God for a sign. Should I intervene or not? Show me whether I should or shouldn't. It was as if a door had suddenly been opened for me to play my part in this unfolding drama. For later that afternoon I was asked by one of the managers if I could stay on a little longer, as a recently vacated cabin needed cleaning for the guests that were arriving the following morning. He had chosen me and not anybody else. "I know it's late in the day," he said, "but the cleaner has suddenly taken ill, and I need this job done pronto." "I'll do it," I said, telling my mother to go back to Snowmass, and I would return later that evening. After the cleaning job was finally completed and I was satisfied that the cabin was indeed presentable, I ambled casually towards the cabin that I'd been cleaning earlier on in the morning. I decided that the best course of action to take was to talk to the lady's husband in private. I would tell him what I'd uncovered about his wife. I knew I risked losing my job for interfering in other people's business, but how could I just sit back and do nothing either? I felt that I'd been guided to speak to this man, as the path had been supernaturally cleared for me after my prayer. As I approached the cabin, I determined that no one was actually there, so that was when I decided to kill some time while I waited for the people to come back, by exploring the woods that flanked the cabin to see if I could get any sightings of the strange critter that I had observed earlier on in the morning, staring at me from the window. I was inquisitive about what it was and was pretty certain it hadn't been a bear. I was eager to get to the bottom of this intriguing, assiduous mystery. I began hiking into the woods and was glad that I was wearing appropriate shoes, as the snow was very deep. That was when I observed these very large footprints in the snow that looked human, only infinitely larger, as the size of these feet were massive and were possibly 18 inches long and 8 inches across. I noticed that the curious footprints trailed deep into the sylvan. I hasten to say curiosity got the better of me, and I was not embroiled in thoughts for my own safety either, which was exceedingly odd. In fact, on the contrary, I didn't give the matter a moment's consideration, as I was desirous to follow these footprints to see where they ultimately led. Nothing was to prepare me for what I would encounter. I stealthily followed the footprints until I observed the dark silhouette of a very large critter whose gargantuan dark brown form was pronounced against the vast undulating expanse of glistening crisp white snow. Luckily his back was turned away from me, and so I quickly took cover behind a rocky outcrop and surreptitiously slid my tiny pair of binoculars out of my handbag to focus in on the critter. I nearly dropped them in astonishment when I realised at once that this critter was no bear. But what on earth was it? This stocky, bulky, hair-covered critter possessed overlong arms and huge human-like hands, and was easily over 7 foot tall and 600 pounds. In a trice it turned around to face my direction, although thankfully it did not discern me. That was when I realised the gravity of what I was seeing, as the humanness of this creature was nothing short of extraordinary. I could hear the involuntary loud thumping of my heart pounding violently in my chest, and even feel its intense vibration as my shaking hands kept watching the critter with a mixture of awe and total wonderment. Then it suddenly dawned upon me like a bright spotlight illuminating my thoughts. Could this be a Bigfoot, I wondered in awe? Of course it was. It couldn't be anything else. I'd always perceived that Bigfoot was a creature of fiction, but I do remember an uncle of mine telling me once that it was highly likely that creatures of fiction may have existed at one time in our reality, like unicorns or elves, and as a young child that idea had always appealed to me, whether it was true or not. As I was considering all this in my mind, my binoculars fell onto the ground with an almighty loud thud, and I was thinking, "Oh no, please, don't let the creature see me." But it was too late. In seconds, the Bigfoot was standing literally 5 feet away from me. For a moment, I was filled with the most gut-wrenching fear that can only imagine is similar to what you might feel standing in the presence of a dangerous predator, much like a lion, tiger, or elephant. For indeed, this creature was built like a rhino and demanded immediate respect. It was easily as intimidating as any of these aforementioned remarkable beasts, maybe even more so. I knew at once that this critter could kill me in a heartbeat without even breaking a sweat, as he was built for speed, power and strength. Every part of his Herculean body was rippled with dense, sinewy muscle. I remember I wanted to run away so very badly, but I just couldn't. I don't even know why. I just stood there staring at the critter, feeling sick to my stomach, and I could taste the nausea rising up at the back of my throat. In that moment I was certain I was going to die. I do not remember a time ever being this terrified by anything before in my life. In fact, my fear level was off the charts. At closer inspection of the prodigious critter, I knew he was the one that had been staring at me through the cabin window earlier on in the morning. I realised by the expression on his face that he also recognised me, and he seemed so delighted to see me, almost as if I was an old friend of his. The critter pointed towards the cabin and then to himself, and I knew he was saying, "I saw you this morning through the window." He began to make a few excited whoops. Whoop! Whoop! That actually made me laugh. In that moment my fear dissipated as fast as the steam from a cup of hot coffee. I pointed towards the cabin and then to him, and I said, "Yes, that was you this morning." The expressive, unusual critter whooped again. Whoop! Whoop! It was like he was saying, "I can't believe it's actually you. And you came all this way just to find me." And I suppose in a strange, curious way, I had done so. That is what I sensed he was actually saying to me, with his exuberant, garrulous chatter that sounded a lot like gibberish. It was incredulous to observe how human this extraordinaire creature was close up, because his deep-set golden brown eyes were intelligent, discerning and kind. I didn't even detect an ounce of malice or aggression towards me on his part. I noticed his leathery grey face was incredibly human-like. His dark nose was flat against his face, and his pronounced brow ridge furrowed with deep wrinkles. I could swear the critter was actually smiling at me as its long thin lips twitched up at the edges. For a long while the critter chatted away jubilantly, and I nodded at him as if I understood everything he was saying, although of course I didn't. I did discern that every time he was happy about something that he was telling me in his chattering language, he would make a low whooping sound. I know people talk about Bigfoots making high-pitched whoops, but these ones were very conversational and expressive, more like an exclamation mark or something being very good or exceedingly pleasing as part of a strange language. All of a sudden we could hear the sound of human voices talking to each other coming towards the cabin, and that was when the critter suddenly became very self-conscious and self-aware. He became reticent and began gliding away, moving his body with such a seamless grace. He looked like he was floating on top of the snow, and one of his strides was easily equivalent to about 5 feet. I realised that by nature, although curious, he was also evasive, elusive and reclusive. I was sad that he had gone, but I realised that the voices were coming from the people that I was intending to visit. I could hear the young man saying to his wife, "Look at the size of these gargantuan footprints," and I realised he must have noticed the Bigfoot trails in the snow. I noted he was still studying them when I approached him. He was bending down on his knees and had placed a pencil next to the footprint by way of a measuring scale. I observed he was taking some cell phone pictures of the prints and was relieved to see that his wife had in fact retreated indoors. He looked up at me in surprise when he saw me coming towards him through the quaking aspen trees and gave me a warm-hearted smile which broke the ice and increased my confidence. "Big, aren't they?" I said, referring to the footprints. "Very odd," he agreed. "Definitely not a bear. But what they are, I can't even imagine." "Sir," I said, "my name is Martina. I need to speak to you about something. I'm your cleaner at the cabin." "Oh, hello, Martina," he said. "Very nice to meet you. What can I do for you?" I proceeded to tell him that I thought his wife might be a secret cutter, and I knew it was absolutely none of my business, and I didn't mean to pry or intrude, but I had personally been a cutter for many years, and getting help was the very best thing that had happened for me, and I thought he should know so that he could help his wife through her problem. The young man became enraged at my impertinence and said to me, "You are right. It's none of your business. Stop poking your nose in my affairs. Your job is to clean, not to offer counselling services to my wife. Now leave us alone at once." I remember walking away, wishing that the ground would swallow me, and with all my heart that I hadn't interfered. I also wished I'd listened to my mother's wise advice. I was now certain that in the morning the man would have filed a complaint against me, and rightly so. I would receive my marching orders, which I well deserved. I also perceived my mother would be mad at me for being such a meddling, presumptuous, interfering busybody. I felt so afflicted by remorse and self-reproach, as if I'd done something treacherously wrong, and even the awe of seeing a Bigfoot was clouded and subdued by my escalating guilty conscience. "You're an idiot," I told myself again and again. "You don't go putting your nose into other people's affairs. What on earth have you done? How could you be so silly?" Imagine my amazement when the following morning the guests had left and my mother and I were cleaning out the cabin, and under the pillow was a letter addressed to me, containing over $2,000, and it read the following: "Dear Martina, I'm writing to apologise you for the way I reacted when you graciously and so eloquently informed me about my wife's deep dark secret. I just didn't want to believe that what you were telling me was true, and that I hadn't discerned that this was indeed going on. I appreciate that it must have taken an enormous amount of courage on your part to tell me all of this, but I'm so pleased that you actually did. My wife lost her father in a skiing accident last year, and I had absolutely no idea that her inconsolable grief was so bad that she had actually sought relief in cutting herself. something that I gather she has been doing for 8 long months now. I knew nothing about this until you graciously brought it to my attention, of which I am eternally grateful to you. Please do not reproach yourself for telling me, despite the negative reception you received on my account. I confronted my wife last night about this issue, and she told me everything, and was so glad and relieved to share her issues with me. I will be ensuring that she receives the help she needs when she returns home. This is a small token of my appreciation for all your troubles on my part. Many thanks, Arthur Bordeaux. I read the letter to my mother and she looked at me in astonishment. You told him about his wife cutting herself? How could you do that? She said, looking at me in horror. I'm sorry, Mum. I know I shouldn't have told her, but I couldn't help myself. I had to interfere because I wanted to help her so badly. In that case, maybe you did the right thing, said my mother. Maybe you were meant to help her. Perhaps you were her earth angel. All this happened 6 long years ago, when a dark cutting secret ultimately led to an encounter with the hairy man himself, otherwise known as Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was pouring with rain outside. It was unrelentingly breaking through the clouds, almost as if the gunmetal sky herself was brooding in a lugubrious melancholia, not unlike my own. It was almost as if the weather herself was commiserating with me, or at the very least mirroring my own sense of grief. I knew my loss was as profound as having learnt that someone I loved had been killed in a tragic car accident. I wondered if I would ever rise above the heaviness in my heart that weighed me down so much that even my movements on this morning were clumsily awkward, reflecting my grievous despair. By all accounts, it would seem that amidst the rain showers that had fallen from the heavens, in bucket loads I might add, intermediate blasts of white hailstones had belligerently burst through the darkening sky, so that old Mr. Riley's house shook from the whooshing vibrations, as the pinging sounds of ice beat against the walls of his red-brick terraced house, like hundreds of bouncing ping-pong balls. Old Mr. Riley's verdant lawn was now spectacularly swathed in a plethora of crisp white little icicles. It looked almost as if dozens of cherry blossom trees had covered the ground in showers of pretty white blossoms, like a bridal shower of confetti, although the hail had brought down with it, and its mighty force, hundreds of leaves and broken twigs that were scattered liberally across the lawns in the neighbourhood, so that if you hadn't known any better, you would have thought it was autumn, as if the trees were wantonly shedding their old clothes. I was in no doubt that after this capriciously thunderous rampage from the heavenlies, that our street had been left an abundance of leaf litter to clean up. I knew the hail would likely have damaged some of Mr. Riley's showy display of roses, which would not make him remotely happy. He was exceedingly proud of his rose garden, which he had nurtured lovingly for many years. Mr. Periwinkle was Mr. Riley's grey and white cat, and on this rather outlandish morning, that would have stood out for me on a calendar in red angry writing, given the dramatic impact the day would ultimately have on the rest of my life, was perched happily on the window-sill, looking rather bemused as he watched the sky exhibit its dazzling acrobatic performance, the likes of such the young cat had probably never seen before a day in his life. It would seem his wide blue eyes expressed a degree of disgusted revulsion. He twitched his appalled tail, tucking it neatly to his side. I knew Mr. Periwinkle, who very much liked his creature comforts, would never dare go outside in this crummy, disagreeable weather, for he abhorred the idea of getting his perfect white-bibbed paws rudely sullied. Mr. Periwinkle detested the rain, and even garden sprinklers were an absolute no-no for the debonair cat. I suspected his extreme aversion to all things wet was probably due to the fact that as a kitten, Mr. Periwinkle had sadly been found lying half drowned in the middle of the road, strewn with large potholes and puddles of water, during a thunderous storm. Old Mr. Riley had discovered the frightened, soaked little kitten when returning from a fortuitous trip to town, At first he thought the little furry bump, lying parked in the middle of the road, was probably a dead rat. He had stopped his car to remove the roadkill, so it didn't get more squished and pulverized by other cars. He hated seeing that done to any animal, even if it was considered venom by most. He believed all life should be respected and honoured. When he bent down to examine the tiny little bundle of fur lying before him, like a matted ball of wool, he had been taken aback when he began to hear it meow. Meow, meow, meow. "You're alive," Mr. Riley had chuckled. "You poor, poor little thing." He had been quite taken aback. "What are you doing lying in the middle of the road like this? This is no place for a little kitten like you. Where is your mother? You could have been run over, you silly little munchkin." Mr. Riley had picked up the kitten and brought her home. "You poor, poor thing," he had said tenderly to the kitten, stroking it gently. "You're soaked to the skin, freezing cold. You could have died out there." Old Mr. Riley had blow-dried the kitten's saturated fur with his late wife's hairdryer, and had given it some minced chicken to eat, which it scoffed hungrily. Mr. Riley had hoped for the very best. The kitten was obviously in a bad way. It was weak, scrawny, very emaciated, and rather bedraggled. Ostensibly, he had been certain that Mr. Periwinkle would not survive the night, but the following morning he had found the tenacious tiny little kitten curled up in a ball under his comforter, lying over his feet, and that had been that. The cat, which at first he thought was a girl, had moved in. Mr. Riley was smitten by the little thing, and who could blame him for that? Mr. Periwinkle was absolutely adorable. To look at, he had long silky hair that suggested that he was of Persian lineage. I would have loved myself to have owned such a delightful bundle of fluff like Mr. Periwinkle, but my husband claimed cats and dogs gave him allergies and made him wheeze, which I suspected was a barefaced lie on his part. My husband, throughout the course of our marriage, would say absolutely anything to get what he wanted. He used the power of manipulation to cast out his spells. I noticed that old Mr. Riley was happily sitting on one of the rather grandiose, stylish wing chairs by a warm, welcoming fire this morning that was crackling away merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, cheerful glow over the cosy living room, and ironing away the icy coldness that the recent rainfall had brought to our homes of late, despite the fact that it was actually supposed to be summer. Certainly it would seem the wet weather made us falsely begin to believe that the winter had never fully abated, like an old, rather unfortunate cough that keeps making a reappearance. Mr. Riley was happily reading a newspaper. The old man found the idea of reading the news from a cell phone not only intolerable but unacceptable. As being in his 80s, he was very much set in his ways. He liked the old-fashioned feel of the paper in his fingers, and his eyes darting over the riveting articles you'd unlikely see on a cell phone. He occasionally looked up at me through his pale blue eyes, heavily crinkled by a road map of endearing lines. "It's bad weather out there this morning," he said. "Imagine being caught out in that hail. Some of those stones are quite sizable. I dare say they could do quite a lot of damage. I mean, look at the leaves. They're absolutely everywhere. I'm worried my roses have taken a huge beating. Some of them have only just burst into bloom, and I've got some prize specimens out there at the moment on display." "Don't you worry, Mr. Riley. I'm sure they will regenerate," I said sympathetically, casting him a watery smile, which did not meet my eyes, because happy this morning I certainly was not. I was naturally trying to hide it well, but I had not been particularly good as an actress at the very best of times. In truth, I was close to bursting into tears. Mr. Riley studied me curiously for a brief moment. He cleared his throat rather awkwardly and said very gingerly, "Are you all right, Fiona? You look a little, what's the word, out of sort, perhaps. Not your usual upbeat, chirpy self, if you don't mind my saying so. It's as if you're wearing the weight of the world on your shoulders. I noticed when you came in this morning you looked a little worse for wear. as if you'd had some rather unfortunate news or something." "I'm fine, Mr. Riley. Really I am," I said hurriedly, squatting his words away with a nonchalant air and waving my arm around as if to say, "No, there's nothing wrong with me," as I rather unsuccessfully attempted to plaster a smile on my face. If Mr. Riley showed me any more concern, it would bring out my self-pity to its knees, and I would crumble into a blubbering heap, and it wouldn't be pretty, because when I broke down, my nose ran, my eyes became red, and my skin blotchy. I wasn't a pretty crier by any manner of means. "I guess it's the weather. It's got me down a little. It's been raining so much lately, hasn't it? And a little sunshine would be very welcome, don't you think? It's supposed to be summer, but I feel as if it's been winter all week. Everyone has returned to their winter clothes. It's really cold out there, Mr. Riley. It's not a pleasant day." "Thank God for your fire. I can see Mr. Periwinkle is thoroughly enjoying it," I said, trying to craftily turn Mr. Riley's attention away from me to his cat. Mr. Riley chuckled to himself. He loved nothing better than to talk about Mr. Periwinkle, who was the love of his life. "Well, you know, Mr. Periwinkle, he loves a cosy, sumptuous fire, does he not? You can bet your bottom dollar he won't be going out of doors any time soon, until the sun is firmly parked in the sky. This kind of weather disgusts him. He seems quite rattled by the hail, poor thing. The cat practically hibernates indoors when the weather is cold or wet." Mr. Riley's eyes dropped down to his newspaper again, and he mumbled in a low, almost inaudible voice that for a moment I barely heard his words. But then, realizing he was not very clear, he raised the volume of his voice and said, "As long as Fiona, that it's only the weather that has upset you this morning. You do know that if anything is worrying you, I'm a very good listening ear, even if I say so myself. It might surprise you to know, Fiona, as I've probably not revealed this to you before. I tend not to advertise this to people for obvious reasons. But before I retired here to Vermont, in my former life I was a psychologist in Montreal, where I lived for many years. As like you, I have dual citizenship. My mother was French-Canadian, you see. So good at listening, I really am. Listening was my profession. I have years of experience behind me. And believe you me, some of the things I've heard my clients tell me over the years would make your hair curl. So nothing you could tell me would ever shock me. So if you need to talk, Fiona, about anything that's causing you some issues, you know exactly where I am." "Thank you, Mr. Riley. But I assure you that if I'm miserable, it's down to the weather, and nothing more." I was privately hoping that Mr. Riley didn't know I was outright lying to him. Of course I didn't care if it was raining. All right, I will admit the hail was moderately irritating. But I did like the rain, especially as it made everything beautifully green, and did all the watering for you. It was easier to blame the weather than tell Mr. Riley the intricate details of my rapidly falling apart life, that this morning had been unscrupulously hit by a wrecking ball of note that I'd never seen coming. For indeed, if I had, I guess I probably wouldn't have even bothered to get out of bed. Instead, I would have burrowed under the sheets, burying myself away for months on end like a hibernating bear. There's something to be said for exiting from the world when the weather is furiously cold. My heart was frozen like an icicle. Indeed, it was so brittle it could easily have broken. I must admit this was my first time learning that Mr. Riley had been a psychologist in his younger days. This was news to me, and something he'd kept from me and the locals in Vermont. Perhaps he didn't want them knowing that he might be psychoanalyzing them. I wondered if he'd been studying me and my family over the last few years, and God knows what he thought about my family's complicated relationships. The thought made me feel a slight twitch of discomfort. I guess it all made sense when I stopped to think about it. I'd never met a greater listener than Mr. Riley. The kind man always inquired after me and my family. It would seem he was always interested in other people's lives. But when you're living all on your own, other people can be extremely interesting. I always wondered why he'd come to Vermont. since he'd lived in Canada most of his life, but it would have been rude to pry about his reason for relocating, because it was none of my business. I suspected, of course, that old Mr. Riley did get lonely from time to time, especially after his beautiful wife Gloria had fortuitously died 8 years prior. It had broken his heart into smithereens like a fragile piece of china, even though he was quite philosophical about it, saying he was at a time in his life when people sometimes did die. "She had a good innings," he said to me. "Died very happy, she did, and I'm certainly glad she did not suffer. I would have hated her to have a long drawn-out illness. It was better her going this way." I had known his wife Gloria since the couple had moved next door to us about 15 years ago. She was a delightful woman. The two of them made the quintessential perfect couple. I understood his wife had been born with diabetes, so she was always monitoring her insulin levels. One day his wife had taken a shopping trip to the local town. Her blood sugar had plummeted, becoming so low, unbeknown to her, as she'd failed to check it that morning, which was something she did as a matter of routine, like brushing your teeth. So why she never checked it that morning is something Mr. Riley never failed to understand. Gloria's blood sugar had been so lethal, she'd passed out in the car into a diabetic-induced coma and driven straight into a tree and was killed on impact. And the devastating loss had hit Mr. Riley hard, throwing his life completely off its axis, as he had hoped, being the older of the two, he would go first, but it hadn't happened that way. I was currently concentrating on the job at hand, through somewhat bleary eyes, busying myself with household chores, industriously hoovering carpets, polishing furniture, and washing dishes in Mr. Riley's house, which I did so robotically every day, with an impressive efficiency. I worked for Mr. Riley 5 days a week, from 9:30 to 12. I tried not to think about the deep sadness that was clawing up into my heart, almost as if hundreds of miniature piranhas were swimming around my bloodstream and indiscriminately tearing away at my flesh, eating me alive from the inside out. I could feel the nausea welling up in the back of my throat, as if I wanted to be violently sick. The closest memory I had to feeling out of sorts like this was when I experienced morning sickness in my 2 consecutive pregnancies, 18 months apart, that had happened such a long time ago. It felt like another lifetime. My 2 boys had grown up and had long since left home, and had chosen to move as far away as possible from our small town in Vermont to a booming Texas state. I knew they'd deliberately chosen to move as far away from us as possible because of their dysfunctional relationship with their father, of whom they despised, and given the way my husband had treated them over the years, with his abrupt, unkind, cursory words, poisoned by cruel, condemning spite, I certainly couldn't blame them for that. I was fortunate to have a great relationship with both of my adult children, but they never spoke to their father, whom they ruthlessly cut out of their lives. He had never been invited to their weddings or christenings of their children. I was now a grandmother, with my 2 adult children having toddlers of similar ages. They lived close to each other on the same street in Houston. I adored my grandchildren and visited them as often as I could. Sometimes I wondered where the time had got to, as it seemed to have slipped through my fingers like greasy butter. It seemed like only the other day when I was 21. I was now in my mid-50s, but judging by the loathsome way I was feeling, I may as well have been a decrepit 100-year-old woman. I certainly felt like one, the way I was chugging along this morning like a train that had run out of all its steam. I certainly didn't want Mr. Riley to see the fretful, unhinged state I was in, nor did I want him to notice the pitying tears that were clandestinely sliding down my cheeks, like sorrowful raindrops, that I wiped away with the back of my sleeve, surreptitiously, scolding myself for being such a big baby. "Get a grip," I kept telling myself over and over again. Everything that had happened this morning had felt so dreamlike, so surreal. It was like it was happening to somebody else. Definitely not to me. How had things gone so badly awry in my life? Why had it just blown up in my face like a grenade? I felt like the Blitz fruit that had been pulverized in the blender for a smoothie at breakfast. That was how emotionally overwrought and disquieted I had become. Naturally, I was grateful for the cleaning I was doing for Mr. Riley. I saw it as the perfect distraction, which was why I had turned up for work in the very first place. I could easily have phoned in sick, gone straight to bed with a Tylenol, spent the entire morning soaking my pillows with my tears and mooching around the place. But what good would that have done? Even so, it would seem, being stuck at work, the inauspicious, ominous events of the morning unfortunately kept replaying themselves in my head over and over again, like a static radio that simply wouldn't shut up, even when you turn off the switch. It was easier to be in denial, rather than admit that the carpet had been so unscrupulously pulled out from beneath my feet, in such an unseemly, inelegant way, bringing up with it all the silty, dirty muck, cobwebs and filth that had probably laid buried there for many, many years. I wondered how life had been this cruel. It certainly wasn't fair. I hadn't deserved any of this. I had lived in this delightful green leafy neighbourhood in Vermont for over 30 long years now. My next-door neighbour, Mr. Riley, was a very dear old man and a good friend. He was in his early 80s now, and although he was fit on his feet and quite mobile, he was useless about cleaning up after himself, which was where I had come into play. In the beginning, the old man had been hoarding all kinds of unnecessary stuff, like magazines and newspapers, that he failed to throw away. But my skillful intervention had changed all that. I'd helped him fix up the mess in his life, but the trouble is, I wasn't good at fixing up my own. Cleaning up other people's messes was a walk in the park for me, but my messes I swept under the sofa and conveniently pretended were not there. I helped Mr. Riley successfully keep his life in apple pie order, as my organisational skills were enviably impressive, so his house these days was deprived of clutter, as all the things Mr. Riley had been squirreling away had been thrown out. I knew if his wife Gloria was alive, she'd be pleased to see the house was in such good shape, and was clean, polished and homely. Certainly for me, as a woman who had never had a job a day in my life, thanks to my husband Gulliver's refusal to allow me to work, it had made me feel reasonably accomplished to look after Mr. Riley. And furthermore, he'd been greatly appreciative of my help. I knew he missed his wife desperately, and as his close neighbour, helping him out with shopping, cleaning, washing, ironing and cooking was the right thing for me to do. When I'd started cleaning, Mr. Riley had offered to pay me for the privilege, and it had been a great way to help a neighbour, and at the same time to earn money on the side. This was handy money that my husband knew nothing about, and I was gradually building up my private little sizable nest egg, where I had a substantial amount of money earning interest in a savings account that I hadn't even touched. Maybe deep down in my subconscious, I might have known all along that I'd need it some day. Mr. Riley paid me handsomely, but over the years I had become more than a cleaner to him. I had become a good and close friend of his, and regarded him like a beloved grandfather figure in my life. I could certainly talk to him about almost anything, but I could not bring myself to tell him about the devastating morning's events that had shattered my world so much, as even I was struggling to digest them, so sharing my troubles would make me fall apart. I was sure of that. I felt as if I was playing a part in a modern-day soap drama that you watch on television, because this shouldn't be happening to me. Suffice to say, the life I'd always known with my husband Gulliver had come falling apart like a plane bursting into flames as it crashes to the earth and is completely obliterated, the wings of its metal torn apart, and like an injured bird, it'll never ever fly again. I closed my eyes as tightly as I possibly could, to will away the burgeoning thoughts that were pushing forcefully through my mind like a tenacious creeping vine that chokes and strangles everything it dares to touch. I vigorously polished the furniture, sensing that Mr. Riley's eyes were pinned directly on me. Please, please don't let him know what's going on with me. I was privately begging myself to hold it together. Fiona, for goodness sake, I told myself sharply, if you let Mr. Riley see your tears, he'll know something's up. I couldn't bear Mr. Riley to feel sorry for me. No one could feel sorry for me. Certainly not more than I did for myself. And any sympathy Mr. Riley might direct my way would likely turn me into a blubbering baby. I wouldn't be able to hold it together, and would burst into uncontrollable sobs and I couldn't allow that to happen. The morning had started traditionally like any other, with the weather forecast predicting an overcast day, with plenty of showers. "It's going to be cold, folks out there today in Vermont. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I know this is not what you want to hear. The rain we've been having of late is here to stay for the next week or so. Brace yourselves, folks. Keep yourselves warmly dressed. Embrace this rain. The plants in our yards are going to appreciate the deluge, so quit the complaining. The sun will be around the next corner. I assure you of that," the radio host had blasted out over the airways, after receiving lots of phone calls from people complaining bitterly that it wasn't fair for the weather to have turned so cold when it was supposed to be summer. "It's global warming, I'm telling you," one person was saying. "That's why there's a dramatic shift in our weather." My husband Gulliver had left for work at 7 o'clock, as he always did every morning, holding his leather briefcase very tightly in his hands, and climbing into his zooty sports car. It was a bright yellow Lotus that was infinitely more cheerful and impressive than he was, and made up for the shortfalls in his dull personality. My husband never wore a smile on his stern face, but he always looked rather debonair and sophisticated in his well-fitting swanky suit and smart leather brogues that were always perfectly polished. As usual, he never bothered to kiss me, barely acknowledging me, as he hungrily wolfed down his eggs and bacon that I'd cooked him for breakfast, as gratitude and appreciation were certainly not one of his strong points. "Right, I'm going," he said in a cursory tone of voice. "See you this evening. I'll be back at my usual time after I've been in the gym." My husband had always fancied himself rotten. He spent an inordinate amount of time in the gym, working out, admiring his reflection in the mirror. Even if we walked past a shop window, my husband would stare admiringly at his silhouette in the glass pane, with a conceited, smug satisfaction. For a man of his age, he was definitely in great shape. I will admit that with a measure of reluctance. Unfortunately, over the years, our relationship had lost its mojo. We had little in common, and did not fancy each other any more, barely communicating with each other these days. He spent his entire life glued to his cell phone. When I entered a room, he would become conspiratorially shifty, as if he had something to hide from me, and was desperately afraid I would see what he was looking at, rather like a rebellious, belligerent teenager looking at some inappropriate material in a magazine that he lightly knew would horrify his mother. My husband had always been humorless. He had a bad temper on him that was as volatile as a brooding earthquake, but over the years I'd learnt to put a lid on this capricious pressure cooker to keep it simmering but not exploding. I would appease my husband's every whim to keep him as happy as a pig in muck. For if my husband was in a good mood, he'd be less likely to lash out at me or the kids. I had not been particularly content during the course of our relationship, but I had managed it like you might navigate a ship over tempestuous, stormy seas. My children had absolutely loathed their father, because he had always been short with them, failing to see any good in his children. He'd often beaten them with a belt when they got out of line, something that I loathed with a burning passion. My husband would always spit the biblical verse out at me, as if I was a bad parent. "He who spares the rod hates his own son," he would say, which really was quite ironic, as my father had never been to church a day in his life, but he certainly knew the Bible verses that he could malleably employ to justify his bad treatment of our children. "Don't you see," I would complain, "you're hurting our boys, not only with your unkind words, but when you physically lash out at them with your belt. Must you hit them so hard? Isn't that physical abuse? Have you seen the horrible marks you leave behind on their bodies? You're turning our children against you. Do you really want to sever your relationship with your own sons in the future? Because that's what you're doing. They're good boys, really, and your discipline is way over the top and extreme. There are more gentle ways to show them the difference between right and wrong, are there not? You're behaving like a headmaster, not a father." Of course, my husband had never listened to me. as he thought anything that came out of my mouth was not worthy of his attention. "Woman, why are you so uselessly stupid?" he would say, stamping his foot in indignation. "Are there no brains in that head of yours, or is it made of pampas grass? I'm doing what is best for our kids, like my father did for me, and look how well I turned out," he said smugly. I remember thinking privately to myself, "That's the problem. You didn't turn out at all well, did you? Because if you did, you might actually be a decent father, and even a good husband to me." Over the years, I guess I just got used to the stinging, barbed and rather thorny way my husband talked to me and to our children. If I had an admirable steely grit and backbone, I would have walked out on him a long, long time ago, like a braver woman would almost certainly have done. But I'd never, ever been the courageous type. I was the one that would shrink into the shadows and hope not to be seen, like I'd done as a schoolgirl, hiding in the back of the classroom so the teacher would never see me. My parents were always getting report cards that said, "Fiona is very shy and timorous." My concern was where would I go with no financial resources and 2 children to take care of. The prospect of being a single mother was far too daunting and overwhelming for me, as I had absolutely no faith in myself. So I guess I just settled, as I felt safer living in the chaos of my turbulent life than starting afresh. Beyond that, I felt my children needed to be raised by 2 parents, even if my husband's discipline could be rather brutal at times. I persuaded myself that he loved our boys in his own way, but the truth is, when the nuts came down to the bolts, even my sons believed emphatically that the only person my husband loved was himself. "Mum, he's a narcissist," my son Ralph had told me on numerous occasions. "I've looked up his character traits online, and Dad ticks the boxes. Admit it, Mum, Dad only cares about himself, and everything else is surplus to requirements. We're all just disposable accessories in his life that can be easily replaced. Dad wouldn't know the meaning of loyalty if it stared him blindly in the face. He should take some tips from the dogs in the neighbourhood, because they're a hell of a lot more faithful than he is to us. One thing is for certain, he doesn't love us." When my son was older and had left home, he told me again, "He's a terrible father who never gave us any attention, and when he did, he beat us within an inch of our lives, and believe me when I say this, Mum, he enjoyed it. After he beat us, I could see it empowered him in some way. It made him feel powerful, like we were the prey and he was the predator, and I think it gave him a kind of a buzz. He was always in a better mood once he'd hurt us in some way. Do you know how many times I went to school, Mum, unable to sit down on the chair at my school desk because my backside hurt so much?" "You never told me that, love. That's terrible," I said in horror, as I digested my son's words. "I knew he hurt you. I never knew you were bent over with pain, though. What your father did to you was inexcusable. I did try to stop him, you know." "I know you did, Mum, but he'd throw you across the room like a frisbee, and you yourself ended up getting hurt. You couldn't stop him, Mum. None of us could." "Even so, no one should beat their own kids up. But your father, in his objectionable way, did what he believed was best for you. It didn't make it right, of course, nor acceptable. I know he can be a terrible bully, but underneath it all, I'm sure he loves you really." "Mum, listen to yourself. Don't make excuses on Dad's behalf. You don't really believe that, do you? If you do, you're deluding yourself. Dad only loves himself. He never loved us, nor has he ever loved you. Love is a verb, and Dad has never displayed love to any of us by his actions. Think about it for a moment, Mum. Never once did he take you out to celebrate your anniversary. I don't believe he ever bought a birthday present for you or for any of us throughout our lives. It was always you buying the presents, you who came to watch our sports games at school, to talk to the teachers. It was you who took us to our extracurricular activities after school. You who bought our clothes for us, cooked for us, read to us, encouraged us, and loved us unconditionally. But where was Dad when all that was happening? If he wasn't being obnoxious, he locked himself away in the study for hours on end, ignoring us all. We were like passing ships to him in the night. I remember thinking at the time that my son was right, but I guess I never truly wanted to admit it to myself. I was set in my ways, and was never comfortable with change of any kind. So I guess I muddied along with the status quo as you do, living in blissful denial, and not really stopping to consider that if I was bold and brave enough to have the courage to leave this man, life could be so much better for both me and my children. I had hated and despised myself for being too afraid to leave the man. It's amazing what you can get used to and learn to live with, even if it does not serve your best interests. By all accounts, what had happened to me this morning I had never seen coming. I closed my eyes as I tried to block out the taunting imagery, as it was stinging to say the very least, as if someone had struck a thorn into a balloon and popped it with one sharp, nasty jab, so it exploded. I was that balloon. Shortly after my husband had left the property, I'd seen an unfamiliar black BMW cautiously rolling up our driveway and parking outside our house, like an oversized squatting black beetle, taking a shower in the rain. I wondered what it was doing there, and who could be paying me a fortuitous visit like this, in not the kindest of weather. I certainly wasn't expecting any visitors, nor did I know anyone that owned a BMW, especially not a black one. I'd often see the curtains twitch from Mr. Riley's house next door, when my husband left for work every morning. I'd get a flashing glance of his inquisitive, wizened face surreptitiously peeking through a crack in the curtain. Gulliver would leave the house every morning, looking like a bad-tempered, belligerent badger, as he was always in a bad mood. He'd robotically move towards his yellow sports car, wearing his stylish suit like a hologram in a computer program that you could make move with a remote control. I guess his movements were rather wooden, and always looked the same day after day. Maybe that was why secretly Mr. Riley always watched my husband leave the house. He was naturally interested in human behaviour, having been a psychologist for so long. My husband's emotionless vaingloriousness may have been fascinating to study from a psychologist's perspective. I noticed a wind was vigorously blowing the branches of the gargantuan oak tree in the front yard. A soft rain pelted down, which was reassuring. I stared out of the kitchen window rather blankly, washing my husband's breakfast dishes in the sink, and getting my rubber gloves covered in warm soapy suds. I had been admiring how beautifully green everything had become of late, thanks to this never-ending week of incessant rainfall. But now intruding on the view was this black BMW, parked in my driveway, while the driver remained seated in the car. Maybe, like a reluctant tortoise, they didn't want to make an appearance due to the rain. Good luck to them in that, because I doubted the rain would subside. I promptly pulled off my rubber gloves and pondered to myself who could be paying me a visit at this early time of the morning. It was not even 8 o'clock yet on my kitchen clock. All I could hear was the ticking of the clock, as once my husband left the premises, the house became unusually quiet. In the beginning it had been tough on me, living in a soundless house after the kids left home, as I no longer heard the chorus of happy laughter, cheerful chatter, eager little feet running across our polished floors. So sometimes I felt terribly alone, as if I was living a somewhat remote, isolated or sequestered life, and I suppose to a degree I probably was. Certainly without Mr. Riley's companionship I'd have driven myself absolutely loopy, even though I had a couple of very good friends who lived in town, but they were always exceedingly busy. These days I'd become well acquainted to the silence, and would often put the radio on to create some soothing background noises, so that the silence in the house could be promptly expunged, and the ambience would lift, making me feel so much better about my lot in life. I watched with a measure of curious ambivalence as the young woman elegantly climbed out of her black BMW, closing the door behind her. She looked oddly familiar to me, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out who she was. I instinctively knew I'd seen her somewhere before. The attractive woman must have been in her early 30s, or thereabouts. Her bird-like brown eyes looked rather nervously towards our terraced home, which was almost an identical copy to Mr. Riley's house, as most of the houses in our street had been built at exactly the same time, so were constructed out of similar coloured bricks, and the windows and roofs were very much the same. The young woman, wearing a well-fitting, flattering pink tweed suit that hugged her hourglass figure in all the right places, opened up a small pink umbrella over her head, so she could avoid getting wet. This mysterious woman, in her rather inappropriate high heels, trotted towards the front door, her shoes making that clacking sound as her heels hit the brick on the driveway. She looked ever so slightly tentative, as if in a quandary. She kept glancing back at her car, almost as if she was wondering whether she should pay me a visit or not. All of a sudden she hesitantly turned around, returning back to her BMW, shaking off the excess rain from her pink umbrella before closing it, and promptly got straight back into the front seat of her car, strapping herself in her safety belt. For a moment her car remained squatting on the driveway, almost as if the woman appeared to be watching our house and waiting for something. Suddenly her BMW spluttered back into life and began to purr contentedly, as if it had been resurrected from the dead. The woman drove away very slowly, with what seemed like a cautious, vacillating hesitancy. I thought that she'd got the wrong address, but moments later she reappeared like another snowdrop, very late in the season. This time her car noisily battered its way up our driveway in an ungainly, almost drunken swagger, and broke into a death rattle as it came to a grinding stop. If I had not heard her clanking approach, I certainly did now. Perhaps she wanted me to hear her. I couldn't be sure. This time the woman seemed indomitably determined. She climbed out of her car eagerly, whisking out her pink umbrella all over again, which she shot above her head into an open canopy to receive the rain. It was as if she had intransigently decided that nothing was going to stop her from sashaying towards our front door and ringing the doorbell. This time, come hell or high water, she was going to do it, even if it killed her. I wondered if this woman was a nervous saleslady of some kind that was eager to sell me something, but had somehow been hit with a barrage of anxiety, and was currently rehearsing her lines like an actress about why I simply must buy her product that she was selling. It wouldn't be the first time a salesperson had come to my door, trying to sell me an industrious strength hoover, or a selection of garden products that apparently I simply could not live without. In my eagerness to find out exactly who she was, I hastily opened the front door, before the woman had a chance to run away again. I was worried she might do just that. On seeing me standing in the open doorway, the woman's face blushed a bright pink colour. "Hi there," she said somewhat reticently. "Are you Fiona Bonrennan by any chance? Have I got the right house?" I don't know why she asked me that question. I sensed she knew the answer all too well. I nodded. "That's right, I'm Fiona Bonrennan. How can I help you?" The woman looked rather uptight. She appeared to be trembling a little. She said demurely, "Do you mind awfully if I come in for a brief moment? I need a word with you. It won't take long, but I need to speak to you about a private, rather delicate matter." "No, of course not," I said to her, gesturing for her to enter my house. "I'm a receptionist at the offices where your husband works. My name is Heidi Esterhazen. I've been working at Kenner's for a good 5 years now, manning the reception desk there. So when you phone into the offices to speak to your husband, you'll usually get me answering your call, or you might get Barbara. So even if you don't recognise my voice, I've spoken to you often." "Oh, yes," I said, throwing my hand over my surprised mouth to cover up my gasp. I knew you from somewhere. I certainly recognise your distinctive voice. So you're Heidi. Of course I remember. Silly me. How could I forget?" Suddenly a memory of a woman in a glamorous, rather tight-fitting red evening dress that left little to the imagination flashed rudely into my mind. I could recall being grievously annoyed when my husband Gulliver couldn't keep his eyes off Heidi Esterhazen at that office Christmas party, Gulliver had looked at her with such admiration, as if she was a breathtaking work of art. I had been very jealous, for never once in our entire marriage had he ever looked at me like that. Now this woman, who was a receptionist at Kenner's, where my husband worked, was in my house, for reasons unknown to me. And I didn't know what the hell she was doing here. Her unpremeditated presence in my house made me feel oddly uncomfortable. However, I do remember, after talking to her at the office party, warming to her immediately. She was such a lovely lady. Intelligent, humorous, interesting. So much more than just a pretty face. I led Heidi rather somberly into my kitchen. She glanced around appreciatively as she took in my state-of-the-art cherrywood kitchen units and sweeping granite countertops that my husband had splurged on extravagantly in a moment of unparalleled generosity that I suspected was more for him than for me. "This kitchen is absolutely amazing," she said admiringly. "It must have set you back a fair sum. I've been wanting to do my kitchen up for ages and ages, but all the quotes I'm getting for the job are insanely pricey." "Thanks," I said. "You're right, putting in a new kitchen is never cheap, but I guess it's an investment, as it increases the value of your home. Well, so I'm told." I ferreted around with the kettle, placing it on the hob while it boiled merrily away. I filled a couple of china mugs with a teaspoon of coffee granules and evaporated milk, and placed them on the granite island. I pulled out a tall cherrywood bar stool, gesturing for Heidi to take a seat, which she did so gratefully, refusing my offer for any sugar. At this point my heart was now booming in my chest. I knew that a receptionist from Kenner's should not be unwittingly paying me a visit like this. Why would she just drop in on me like this unannounced? I could smell something was up, and whatever it was, I knew deep down in my gut it was not good. Heidi promptly took the words out of my mouth when she abruptly just said, "Look, I probably shouldn't have come here this morning. I was in two minds about whether I should or not. I'm not sure it's even my business, but certainly if I was in your shoes, I'd want to know the truth. And I don't want to upset you, so I'm not going to beat around the bush. I don't know if you know, or even care for that matter, as I know some women don't care a toss what their husband gets up to behind their backs. But I've got a sneaky suspicion, after having met you in person at that office party and having spoken to you, that you're the type that would care." She paused for a brief moment, drawing in a deep breath, dropping her head to her coffee mug and fiddling with the handle awkwardly. She then lowered her voice. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bronbrennan, but your husband, well, he's having an affair. There's no easy way to tell you this." I nearly spat out my coffee I was drinking. "What with you? Oh, my God! My husband's having an affair with you!" I asked her, eyeing her up and down rather suspiciously. "I saw the way Gulliver was looking at you at the office party. He couldn't keep his eyes off that red dress you were wearing. You did look good. Oh, goodness gracious, are you in love with him? Is that why you came here today? To tell me you want my husband for yourself, and that you're wildly in love with him? Is that what this is all about?" "Me?" laughed Heidi. "Absolutely not. I'd never have an affair with a married man, especially not your husband. Never your husband in a million years. Besides, he's a lot older than me. I prefer men my own age. But having said that, your husband has tried his luck with me, as he has with a few other women at the office. But none of us have fallen for his disingenuous tongue-in-cheek charms. He's got a bit of a roving eye, but you must know that already. Most of the women at work wisely keep well away from him. They know exactly what he's like. He's full of himself. He thinks he's God's gift to woman, that's for sure. He's cocky, arrogant, and opinionated." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "It's rude of me to come here shouting the odds against your husband like this, and ruthlessly assassinating his character. But as you can see, I don't particularly like him." "Don't worry, you won't be the first person to assassinate my husband's character. I never thought he was a player, though, as you're suggesting he is. Why did you want to tell me about it? I don't exactly understand what's in it for you. Why do you care so much about whether I know or not about his philandering ways? Ostensibly, most folk would turn a blind eye, to any office shenanigans and pretend not to know what's going on under their very noses. Heidi looked a little discombobulated. I'll level with you if I may. Your husband is having an affair with a girl that works with me in reception, manning the switchboards. We both answer all the incoming calls and take alternative lunch breaks, so one of us is always covering, the switchboard. I'm afraid this young lady is nesciently naive, callow, and impressionable. She's a sweet, jejune little thing. Her name was Barbara Flores. She's in her early 20s and hopelessly in love with your husband. Yesterday, your husband Gulliver proposed to Barbara Flores. She's young enough to be his daughter, which I think is incredibly distasteful. If that isn't bad enough, he bought her an expensive diamond engagement ring. He's asked her to marry him, even though he admitted to her that he's still married to you. He told her he'd work his way around to asking you for a divorce. What? I asked. He asked this woman to marry him. You are kidding me. This is a joke. It's got to be. Heidi nodded sorrowfully. I'm not kidding, Mrs. Von Rennen. But believe me, I wish I was. When I saw the extravagant engagement ring that the dewy-eyed Barbara was wearing on her fingers, that must have cost a sizable fortune, let me tell you. I was absolutely appalled, especially when I learnt you had absolutely no idea that your husband had asked another woman to marry him. I realised you probably didn't know what was going on, and I remembered how much I'd liked you at that office Christmas party. I didn't think you deserved such contemptuous treatment. I thought I should warn you in advance, so you'd decide what you needed to do about this, and you're not taken completely off guard. I couldn't believe that your cad of a husband could have such a lovely wife. You're far too good for him, Mrs. Von Rennen. I hope you know that. Let's just say if my husband was carrying on treacherously with another woman behind my back, I'd want to know about it, that's for sure. Not that I'm married, but if I was, I'd certainly want to know. It's humiliating to be left in the dark like this. Furthermore, this is not just about you, Mrs. Von Rennen. I'm very concerned about Barbara's welfare. I'm very fond of her, you see. I guess you could say I'm like a mother figure to her in the office. When she started working at Kenner's, I took her under my wings. I became naturally protective towards her. Sadly, her father tragically passed away a couple of years ago. They were as thick as thieves. She's still grieving his loss. The tragedy is that your husband is a dead ringer for her late father. Let's just say Gulliver could be her father's double, without exaggeration. That's why I think she's so enamoured and rather bewitched by your husband. Most people in the office can see right through him and his guileful ways, but not Barbara Flores. I think she's suffering from what is known as an Oedipus complex, when women want to marry men that rather remind them of their fathers. It's a train smash waiting to happen, let me tell you. I'm so worried about Barbara. I don't want her to get hurt. She's very vulnerable at this stage. And she's been through so much grief, losing her dad like that. I've been warning her off, Gulliver, telling her he's no good for her, but she rejects anything I say, claiming that they're madly in love with each other. My husband should know better, I said, finishing Heidi's sentence for her. Honestly, what is he thinking? I'm so sorry, Mrs. Von Rennen. It can't be easy to hear all of this. Call me Fiona, I said insistently. I'm sorry, Fiona. Are you all right? You've gone as white as a sheet. The colour's drained from your face, and I'm responsible for doing this to you. I think I did the wrong thing coming here this morning, directly after your husband left for the office. I'm so sorry about all this, but I really thought you needed to know what was going on at Kenner's. I'm as white as a sheet, Heidi, because I'm in shock, believe me. I'm grateful that you were bold enough to come here today to tell me the truth. I really appreciate it. You're absolutely right. It doesn't do to be cluelessly uninformed or incognizant about what your spouse is getting up to. That man is the absolute end. He's a right piece of work. I cannot believe I never saw any of this coming. I've been a complete fool. The warning signs were even at that Christmas party, when my husband was looking at you inappropriately. But as usual, I was in denial. I just refused to believe my husband had unfaithful intentions towards me. I thought our marriage was doing fine, although in truth we've never been close or particularly happy together, if I'm being honest. But then again, I don't think anyone could get close to that husband of mine, even if they tried. He's like a one-way street. You can never turn around and find out who he really is, as you'll reach a dead end. I'm so nonplussed that he had the audacity and arrogance to propose to another woman before he even asks me for a divorce. I mean, who does that? It's disrespectful, ungracious, bumptious, and completely insulting. He probably wants to make sure that Barbara will marry him before he dumps you. It's like a security blanket, I suspect, ensuring he's got a backup plan so that he's never left on his own. I think your husband is a narcissist, Fiona. Don't take his behaviour personally. It's no reflection on you. You've done nothing wrong. If it makes you feel any better, I don't think your husband is in love with Barbara. In lust, most certainly, and that's clear to see. But Barbara is a pretty thing. Her biggest problem is she's so ingenuous. I think Mr. Bonrennan just wants an attractive mannequin on his arm, and the fact that she's interested in him strokes his ego, makes him believe he's all that, when he absolutely is not. I think he's a Casanova. You think he's a Casanova? I said, completing Heidi's sentence for her. Yes, something like that. Certainly he thinks he's a real Romeo. I know the men back at the office, some who are much, much younger than your husband, secretly feel desperately sorry for him. It's pathetic to want a woman that could potentially be your own daughter. I heard a couple of them sniggering about him behind his back the other day. And believe me, you don't want to know what they were saying. I thanked Heidi for coming to see me, and for a moment I was emotionally blank and internally numb, as if my vacuous emotions had been anaesthetized. The rain unabashedly continued to pour down onto the entire neighbourhood, and looked unlikely to abate. With fumbling fingers I tried to send my husband a message on my cell, but I began to shake so much that it kept slipping through my fingers, my cell phone I mean, as I pressed the wrong keys all the time. I finally managed to tame my trembling fingers and punch in the words, "I know about you and Barbara." I clicked send. It must have been about 30 minutes later that my husband's yellow sports car predictably rolled up the drive. My husband climbed out of his car and slammed the car door behind him, and marching indignantly towards our terraced house in the pouring rain, looking like he had a fly he seriously wanted to swat and to exterminate, and that fly was me. In truth, I wanted to run and take cover from him. He looked as manic as a belligerent young male elephant in musk, and promptly stormed through the house like a capricious raging tornado. His leather shoes boomed across our wooden floorboards, so that everything rattled and shook rather precariously, and I became worried about my display of Wedgwood plates on the dresser, that they would come crashing down to the ground. Suffice to say, he did not even have the decency to look remotely repentant about his recent indiscretions. On the contrary, he looked exasperated with me. That I had found out his dirty little secret. It had given me power over him, not the other way round, and this annoyed him greatly. He was anchoring his hands on his hip, glaring at me defiantly, as if I was the most repugnant thing he'd ever beheld in his entire life, as if I was the pile of doggy muck at the park that he'd just stood in. I dare say he'd likely have treated a cockroach with greater respect than me, before he finally took great pleasure in squashing it under his boot, which is what he'd like to have done to me as well, I suspect. "Who told you about Barbara?" he snapped. "Who the hell told you about her? It was not their goddamn business to interfere in my private affairs. Bloody cheek! I'll kill the person who told you about this. Who the hell was it? You better tell me." "It doesn't matter who told me about your cosy little girlfriend, Gulliver. What matters is that you have been cheating on me with a girl young enough to be your own daughter. If that's not bad enough, you've had the brass iron nerve to propose marriage to this woman, and you're not even divorced from me. I don't know what's going on with you, Gulliver. You're clearly going through some kind of midlife crisis. You're not thinking straight. You're making a complete fool of yourself, and people are probably laughing at you behind your back. Your inappropriate behaviour with such a young girl has got the tongues wagging at Kenneth. Some of the men at work have been saying some rather unkind things about you, I believe. I mean, if you're unhappy with our marriage, we could get some counselling, fix things. But we can't just throw away 30 years of marriage as if it means absolutely nothing. Gulliver scoffed. Not thinking straight? Are you kidding me? Of course I'm thinking straight. I've never thought straighter or clearer in my entire life about anything. It's a damn shame I've taken so long to come to my senses. I guess I just pitied you. You're so pathetically needy. For the record, I'm not going through a midlife crisis of any kind. And if you think some kind of therapy will help us rekindle our relationship, you're sorely mistaken. That is never going to happen. I had suggested we fix things, because now my husband was giving me an out. I didn't want it, as the thought of being alone was too much to bear, or even contemplate. How could I cope with being on my own at my age? With a deliberating sense of dismay, I saw my future being flushed away, like the dirty bathwater, to make room for what Gulliver wanted. During the course of our marriage, it had always been about what Gulliver wanted, what he needed, what he must have. No one else mattered. Gulliver didn't want to have pets, so we had none. Gulliver didn't want me to work during the course of our entire marriage. As it made him look bad, well, that's what he claimed, and so I didn't. My whole world had revolved around my husband Gulliver, and I could not pathetically envisage my life without the man, even though it had been one hell of a miserable, turbulent, rocky and precarious ride. It was like I'd been stuck on a roller coaster that would make most people violently sick, but I'd never got off the ride, and had grown used to being jolted around like a bean rattling away in a jar, and never knowing a moment of peace. In truth, I didn't know any other life. I had grown comfortable and reasonably content with the glibness of my everyday life, like a prisoner may become used to his incarceration after a while. Maybe I was a complete coward. I probably was. But I didn't welcome change of any kind, and I resisted it stubbornly, like a kid refusing to visit the dentist. I mean, could you blame me for that? I don't want to fix things, Fiona. Not all the king's horses or king's men could ever put us together again. We are broken. You hear that? Broken. We can never be mended. Can you get that through your thick skull, Fiona? Or are you really that dim? You are boring, fat, stupid. I mean, look at you. He waved a hand, contorting his face in disgust, as if the sight of me absolutely repulsed him. You've let yourself go, Fiona. You're a train wreck. When we got married, you used to make an effort, take a pride in your appearance, but not any more. You don't even try to look nice for me anymore. Your hair looks like it's been caught up in a tornado. Your grey roots are always showing. You're too damn lazy to cover them up, or bother to even book an appointment with a stylist. When did you last wear any lipstick? Or an elegant dress for that matter? Every time I see you, you're wearing those hideously ugly leggings and those loose baggy tops. When will women learn how ugly those things are? Especially when your body's in bad shape. But even on a slim figure, those leggings are hideously grotesque. I'm sorry, but they are. My husband's words were a cruel, cold, verbal slap in the face. I wanted to argue with him, but as I glanced down at my clothes, an oversized, loose-fitting, sloppy shirt hung over my elasticated leggings that showed off my imperfections in all their glory, and I knew this to be true. I knew I had gained a substantial amount of weight over the years, and gone up 4 dress sizes. I hasten to say boredom and a couple of pregnancies had made me put on 40 more pounds in weight, and try as I might, the weight seemed impossible to shift, and it stuck to me like superglue, as if saying, I'm not going anywhere. I had wanted to go out to work, but my husband was having none of it. My place remained in the home, taking care of him and our children. Gulliver was always reminding me that I had no skills, and if I found a job I would probably be earning minimum wage. And he had crushed all there was left of my self-esteem and confidence, like a seashell beneath his foot. Over the years he'd made me feel pretty close to useless. Was it any wonder that these days I didn't make a great effort to turn on the glamour for him? I mean, what was the point? Gulliver never appreciated my efforts in the very first place. I'd lost interest in even bothering. Besides, he never took me out anywhere fancy. And now he was making me feel like a great big ugly fat tub of lard, useless, worthless, hideously undesirable. And I was beginning to believe it was true. I could barely bring myself to look at my face in the mirror these days, without physically squirming in disgust. I hated the way I looked. My husband, sensing my reluctance to respond to his grievances, continued with his eager assassination of my character.
"You're a slob, Fiona. A great big fat ugly lazy slob. I don't fancy you, and I never will. Surely you've seen the writing on the wall as far as our relationship is concerned a long, long time ago. If you must know, the very sight of your body turns me off. That's why I never touch you these days."
The cruelty of my husband's unkind words stole my breath away from me. The level of meanness directed towards me threw me off my perch. Where did all the vindictive hating and spite come from? What had I ever done to deserve to be spoken to like this? I could feel a rebellious rage within me rise up through my chest. How dare my husband address me in this condescending, cruel way? How dare he belittle and patronize me like this? I was not going to put up with being trashed like this. "So you think you're all that, do you?" I said, determined to give him a jab where it really hurt. "Take a long hard look at yourself, Gulliver, in the mirror. You're getting old. Sorry, it's true. The wrinkles are clear to see on your face. You have a receding hairline, don't you? And what's left of your hair has turned grey. So before you're so quick to point a finger at me, you're no Adonis yourself, and I can assure you of that. You flatter yourself, Gulliver, because a younger woman is showing interest in you. Barbara Flores, that's her name. It makes you feel validated, doesn't it, as a man, that someone young enough to be your daughter has fallen hopelessly in love with you. Do you realise how pathetic it is? I almost feel sorry for you. Poor, poor woman. That's all I can say. Do you realise Barbara Flores is only in love with you because you're a dead ringer for her father, which makes your relationship with her all the more tragic. You mark my words, when she gets older, she'll wake up and smell the coffee and abandon you, like you intend to abandon me. How many young women stay with older men indefinitely? Not many. And the stats prove this over and over again, especially men like you, Gulliver. My husband sucker-punched me, with yet more cruel blows that were worse than what you would receive in a boxing ring, as they cut through the sinew of my self-esteem, with a razor-sharp efficiency that really, really hurt.
"I'm in damn good shape, I'll have you know," my husband retorted. "Unlike you, I happen to take pride in my appearance. I go to the gym every day. I look after myself. Sorry to burst your delusional bubble, but Barbara Flores loves me. We're getting married. There's not a damn thing you can do about it. A lot of men have successful relationships with younger women, I'll have you know. Look at Celine Dion, for example, and Catherine Zeta-Jones. They married older men, did they not? And their relationships clearly worked. They're the exceptions to the rule. And furthermore, you don't know what really went on behind closed doors in their lives. But if you look at the stats, huge age differences don't work. I remember reading about it somewhere, and it makes perfect sense to me." "You're just jealous, Fiona. It's obvious you are. Get over it, will you? I've moved on. So should you. You cannot say you never saw this coming. If you didn't, you're a fool. But then again, being bright was never one of your strong points, was it, dear? No wonder you could never get a job. You always said you wanted one, but I knew you'd be practically useless in the workplace, so I actively discouraged you from working. Now you listen up, will you? I want you out of the house and out of my life. Do you understand? I've had enough of you. I want you to pack up your things and get the hell out of here. And when I come back this evening, I expect to see you gone. You can put your front door key under the doormat for me, so I can give it to Barbara Flores. She's going to be living with me here from now on. I'd like a divorce as soon as possible, because if I don't see your ugly face again, Fiona, it'll be too soon. So I'll be in touch with you through my solicitors, so you better let me know your new address. Maybe you should go to Texas, move in with one of our boys. They'd love to have their perfect little mummy living with them, looking after the grandkids. But you can't do that to me, Gulliver. Fair enough. If you want a divorce, I will give you one, with the greatest of pleasure. I will remind you, half of everything in this house is mine, which includes the house itself. So you cannot sell me short on any of this. It won't work. We were married for 30 years, for goodness sake. Gulliver smirked. Is that how you want to play it, Fiona? You're not getting a bean of my money fee. You can go on Social Security for all I care, until you find a proper job. If you're capable of keeping one, that is. I suppose you could flip burgers at McDonald's for a living. You heard me loud and clear. I'm throwing you out of this house. And when I get back this evening, you better be gone or else. And with that, my husband stormed out of the house belligerently, kicking his feet, leaving an unfortunate ambience behind in the house that was so poisonously toxic that I wanted to escape the fumes of his wrath, as if the house itself needed to be fumigated, and my desire to remain here completely dissipated, because the place stank of my husband, and the thought of him moving his love interest in here made me want to throw up my entire breakfast. I had been vigorously polishing Mr. Riley's coffee table, thinking about all this, trying so hard not to, but my husband's cutting words kept slicing through my dignity. I was so caught up in my woes, I had failed to hear Mr. Riley's voice. Fiona! 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 He was practically shouting at me by now. I was so caught up in my daydream. Oh, sorry, Mr. Riley, I said, flushing red with embarrassment. I didn't hear you. I was miles away. I apologized. Silly me. Yes. Sorry, what is it that you wanted? It's not what I want, Fiona. This is all about you. You need to sit down. Mr. Riley led me by the hand and beckoned for me to sit on the wing chair, opposite to where he'd been seated, indulgently reading the morning paper. The living room was so lovely and warm, and watching the flames of the fire dancing merrily over the firewood was comforting. Mr. Periwinkle promptly jumped off the window ledge and settled on my lap and began to purr contentedly. I ran my fingers through his silky fur, drawing great comfort from the affection he displayed towards me. At least there was someone in the world who didn't find me objectionable. I should have had animals a long time ago, despite what Gulliver had said. They never judged you, nor did they condemn you, but accepted you as exactly as you were, with unconditional love. Whether you were as fat as a sumo wrestler, as hairy as an ape, as smelly as some rotting fish fillets going rank in the trash, come rain or sunshine, they loved you without prejudice or discrimination. And that is what I loved about animals. I'm sorry, Fiona, love, but something is terribly wrong with you this morning, said Mr. Riley. As I told you, I was a psychologist for many long years, so I'm quick to pick up on people's moods. You can talk to me about anything, you know you can. If this is about your husband, has he done something to upset you? I knew the moment you stepped into the house this morning something was very much awry. You've been polishing the same spot on the coffee table for over 15 minutes now, which is overkill, is it not? What's up, Fiona? Please talk to me. I may be old and less steady on my feet than I was, but my ears remain very good, and I'm an excellent listener. Maybe I can help you, and I would like to help you if I may. I would enjoy being useful for a change. That would please me greatly. So go on, tell me what's going on. Mr. Riley's kindness opened up the floodgates of my despair. The tears came rolling down my cheeks. and I unapologetically began to blubber as the roof of my world collapsed in on me, and I felt as if I was buried under piles and piles of rubble in a landfill site or something like that, and that all the breath had been sucked right out of me. Why was my life such a dreadful mess? I should have left Gulliver a long time ago if I'd known what was good for me, but I'd never had the courage to do it. Now he'd pushed me out of his life like the potato peelings you cast down the waste disposal unit, as if I meant absolutely nothing to him.
There, said Mr. Riley kindly, offering me a box of tissues so that I could blow my nose and wipe away my tears.
Nothing is ever that bad, Fiona. Let it out, will you? Crying is good for you. It's never a good idea to hold on to grief. It can eat away at your soul like nothing I know. Now tell me what happened to cause you so much distress.
Isn't it obvious? I said, my eyes filling with tears. My husband wants a divorce. He's fallen in love with somebody else.
Your husband wants a divorce, said Mr. Riley, looking quite startled by this revelation. He wants a divorce, does he? He needs his head examining. The man is lucky to have a woman like you. What on earth is he thinking? Does he need his head looking at? Or does he need to go for a brain scan, perhaps?
He says I'm fat and ugly and I'm stupid. And he says I'm boring. He wants to exchange me for a younger, prettier model that's as thin as a beanpole, I suspect, who dresses prettily and goes to the stylist as regular as clockwork, and probably lives on celery, for all I know.
Does he now?
Said Mr. Riley, unable to disguise the disgust that had implanted itself on his face.
Personally, I wouldn't describe him as having a riveting personality, would you? He's got as much charm as a rattlesnake. I see him leaving for work every morning in that yellow, swanky sports car of his. And do you know what I always think, Fiona?
No. What do you think? I asked.
I think to myself, it's a good job he's got a yellow sports car, as everything else about your husband is dull, like watching paint dry. So that flashy car makes him look a little bit more interesting, only a tiny bit more. You, on the other hand, Fiona, are funny, charming, beautiful, and a breath of fresh air. And you're certainly not fat. I always wondered when I watched your husband shooting off in his car like a rocket, what it was that he'd done to deserve someone as lovely as you. I could never work it out, especially after I met him in person, and saw the apathetic way he treated you and your children. It was shoddily deplorable. Even my wife said as much.
That's why the kids live in Texas, you see. They hate him. They couldn't get far enough away from him. To be fair, he hasn't time for them either. He said if he had fertilized another woman's eggs, then he'd have had superior children than what he had with me.
Did he now? He's obviously got a very high opinion of his sperm. I think it speaks volumes about his character, that your own children want absolutely nothing to do with him. In my experience, children do not normally hold their parents in such scant disregard, although of course it does happen from time to time. Your adult children have very good reason to feel the way they do. Your husband has never been kind towards them, or to you for that matter, so he's reaping exactly what he sowed.
I used to be 40 pounds thinner, Mr. Riley. My husband likes the anorexic look in a woman. The thinner the better as far as he's concerned. He loves to see a woman's collarbones. He finds that very sexy. When I married him, I was like a beanpole, and he really liked that, you see. He found that incredibly attractive. And now, of course, I've just got so big. And he hates that. In those days, I just couldn't put on weight. I was the envy of so many, for that very reason. But after I had babies, they were born, and my metabolism just changed. I couldn't lose the weight. And he found the changes in me repugnant.
Well, I think you're lovely, Fiona, and I think you're being incredibly hard on yourself. Your self-esteem has taken a great big battering thanks to that man. Don't let him eat away at your confidence like a worm in an apple. So what if he wants a divorce? Give it to him. You're well rid of him if you ask me. If someone is willing to spit you out as if you're worthless, then they're undeserving of you. Don't you ever forget that. I can promise you this, my dear Fiona. Your husband will recognize the error of his ways after you get divorced from him. He'll likely come back begging you to take him back, especially when he realizes that nobody else wants him, and this young lady decides to kick him to the curb, and that's very likely to happen with the generation deficit between the two of them. So it's likely to come back to bite him. I saw it a lot in my practice, you know. People regretting their divorces. Sometimes people don't know how good they've got it until they lose it all, and then they realize what they allowed to slip through their fingers like grease.
He's never loved me, Mr. Riley, so I doubt he will regret losing me. Men like him just don't care about anyone except themselves. Gulliver's always been like that. If Barbara Florist dumps him in the end, he's the type of man that will find a new replacement very quickly. He has to have a woman on his arm to validate himself.
That's probably because he's a narcissist with antisocial personality disorder, said Mr. Riley. So tell me, what's your plan going forward, Fiona? Because you can't possibly stay in that house now. You need to get far away from that man.
I don't actually have a plan, Mr. Riley. My husband told me he wants me gone by the time he gets back from the office tonight, so he can move in Barbara Florist into the house. I mean, I've lived there for 30 long years as his wife, and now he's tossing me out like a piece of old trash. He says I need to leave the house forthwith, and I'm not going to get a bean from the divorce settlement. Mr. Riley raised his bushy white eyebrow and smiled. There was a glimmer of satisfaction in his kind blue eyes. He looked moderately amused by this startling revelation.
Well, your husband, Fiona, is in for a bit of a rude awakening, I have to say. As his wife, you're entitled to half of everything, and there is not anything he can do about it. In regards to staying at the property, of course, I would advise you to leave at once. You could, of course, stay, but do you really want to remain in a toxic, malignant environment like this, with your husband breathing down your neck and treating you with such a dispassionate disregard? You don't want to be around when he gets home at night, moving this Barbara Florist in with him. That would be utterly soul-destroying and gut-wrenching for you, and incredibly humiliating, and you don't want that.
You're probably right, Mr. Riley, but where on earth will I go? I can't possibly throw myself on my kids' mercy. They have their own lives in Texas to live. I've been completely dependent on my husband over the years. But the good news is I do have a stash of cash that I've saved, which he knows absolutely nothing about. You see, I kept my cleaning job with you a secret from him, Mr. Riley. I never really knew why. Possibly because he'd forced me to stop cleaning for you. And there's no doubt he's always wanted me to be completely dependent on him, not remotely self-sufficient.
Well, don't let him know about your earnings, Fiona. If I know your husband, he'll probably be closing down your joint credit cards, so you won't be able to access them. I know his type all too well, but he won't get away with it. As the law is on your side, he'll have to pay up and give you half of his assets. That is how it usually works. He won't be remotely happy about it, of course, but he hasn't got a choice in the matter. And I personally will make sure I find you a great solicitor to deal with him, so you get exactly what you deserve.
I had not thought that he might stop our credit cards, but you're absolutely right. That is exactly what he'd do. The man has no scruples. I wouldn't put it past him to do something so mean like that.
I know exactly where you should go, Fiona. In fact, I've got the perfect place for you, said Mr. Riley suddenly.
He appeared to be becoming excited, almost as if a bright idea had just dawned on him. Where? I asked, looking at Mr. Riley in confoundment.
It might surprise you to learn that I happen to own a beautiful, rather charming cottage in Canada, Fiona, with prepossessing country views. It's quite idyllic. Mind you, I haven't been there for an age, so goodness knows what the place looks like now. I hire a cleaning lady to look after it, to keep it in good nick, and I am just hoping that she does. It's a 4.5-hour drive from here. It's situated close to Ottawa National Park. Regretfully, I've never been back. Couldn't bring myself to do it somehow. Too many nostalgic memories, I suspect. Gloria put her indelible, elegant signature on the place. It's sumptuously homely, very cosy. You will almost certainly love it there, if I know you. It's a breathtakingly beautiful part of the world, very idyllic. Now why don't you go and live there for a while? Let your hair down. Have a little breather. You can stay there as long as you like. And certainly, if you like it enough, I will be more than delighted to leave it to you in my will, along with a little nest egg that I've been intending to leave you in my will. Because your friendship, Fiona, has meant a great deal to me, more than you will ever know. It's been invaluable, precious, more than members of my own family, that I never get to see from one year to the next. Blood is not always thicker than water, Fiona. You've been like a daughter to me. When someone gives something to your life that brings meaning, purpose, and happiness, it's good to give back to the very person that generously did that for you. So I want to do it for you in your case.
It's awfully kind of you, Mr. Riley, but there's no need. And I can't possibly accept such a kind offer of yours. Besides, who will look after you without me around? If I go and live at your cottage in Canada, who will cook and clean for you?
Don't you worry your pretty little head about me, Fiona. You think far too much about other people. It's time to think about yourself. I'm big and ugly enough to look after myself, I assure you. Besides, I can get Ellie Watkins to help me around the house, to keep up the very good work that you started here. I understand she's very efficient. She cleans some of the houses in the neighbourhood around here, and that woman loves to gossip. So I won't get lonely, that's for sure. Ellie could talk the spines of a porcupine if given the chance. Of course I will miss our conversations, Fiona, most greatly. But that's not to be worried about, because we can connect with each other on Skype regularly and keep in touch that way. And it'll be like you're still living next door to me. I emphatically believe, Fiona, that you need to get some space between you and your husband, Gulliver. I think going to Canada will give you the freedom to find yourself again. Your whole life has been focused on caring for your husband and children. It's about time you focused on yourself for a change. Word of advice, Fiona. You're going to need to leave Gulliver your residential address at the cottage in Canada for all the negotiations between your solicitor and his. But the best thing you can do, Fiona, is to get away. You mark my words, it's the soundest, most circumspect piece of advice that I can possibly give you.
Mr. Riley did not need to persuade me any further. I knew his advice was absolutely sound and made perfect sense. So 4 hours later, I'd packed up my suitcases and driven all the way to Canada, ever grateful to have dual citizenship, as it meant I got across the border relatively seamlessly, with the border guards barely giving me a second glance. Indeed, the irreproachable, unflawed journey had gone so flawlessly, without any hitches along the way. It looked as if it was almost meant to be. Perhaps I was supposed to come to Canada. My GPS gallantly guided me past a ubiquitous amount of pastoral agriculture land, lonesome farmhouses, fields of grazing cows, frolicking horses, silvery ponds of reflectant water, and far too many trees everywhere you looked. All shapes and sizes they were in, too many to count. I knew I was getting close to Mr. Riley's cottage when the farmhouses along the way became more infrequent and scattered. Soon my car was rolling steadily down some undulating, sequestered country roads, with hilly embankments upholstering the sides of the road. They were peppered with verdant grassland. The embankments rolled out like an ancient scroll, stretching out into thick blankets of woods, boasting tall, lofty trees, lush with viridescent foliage. They pirouetted up into the sky like skyscrapers. The congregation of trees was a mixed tangle of quaking aspens, maples, oaks, and jack pine trees, so typically seen in this part of the world. In truth, I felt as if I was in the middle of nowhere, and I was seriously beginning to wonder if I was in fact lost. Finally, my GPS told me to take the next turning to my right, and that I had in fact reached my destination. What, I thought, looking rather bemused, but it just can't be. There must be some mistake. The GPS has got it wrong. There is nothing here but trees, trees, and still more trees. I haven't seen a tractor for ages. There is no way Mr. Riley's cottage is around here. I reduced my driving to a tortoise-like crawl. I skimmed the trees for any sign of a clandestine driveway or inlet hidden amongst the trees that was not clearly visible from the road that I might easily miss. Then I hit pay dirt. I noticed a small little opening between the trees that was incredibly narrow, so narrow, in fact, that I almost missed it. Feeling heartily relieved and rather pleased with myself, and of course my gallant efforts, I cautiously turned down this narrow path through the trees, many with branches that reached out to scratch my vehicle, probably because they hadn't been cut back for a very long time. I followed the road in a straight line, until it opened up into a huge, rather generous grassy clearing that overlooked a backdrop of plump, bosomous hills, covered in seasonal alpine flowers, christened by a scattering of trees, along with a silvery stream of obstreperous water that battered its way frenziedly through the valley, over some prominent sculptural rocks and stones. There, in pride of place overlooking the stream, seated like a grandiose queen on her throne, wearing a glistening white dress that sparkled in the dancing shadows of the late afternoon, was the most perfect-looking white cottage I'd ever seen, nestled on a rocky swell that almost lifted the cottage up on a pedestal. It was so incredibly pretty it took my breath away, and bricks and mortar of any kind had never actually done this to me before. But in this place I felt a sense of belonging. Untamed wild roses seemed to crawl up the roughly white-plastered walls in spectacular showy showers of red and pink blooms. It was almost as if the cottage, which was caught up in the soft fading light of the afternoon sun, was smiling at me, warmly, giving me a friendly welcome, as if it was glad to see me. Wow, I thought, this place is absolutely amazing. I had not expected the cottage to be anywhere near as nice as this. It far exceeded my wildest expectations. Mr. Riley had almost certainly underplayed how delightful a cottage it actually was. "Thank you, Mr. Riley. This place is perfect," I said contentedly, under my breath. "And if you do leave this place to me in your will, I'll promise you this, I'll never leave it." I knew I meant every word of that sincere promise in my heart, as it felt like I'd come home, and I'd never really felt like this about a house before. Certainly my house in Vermont that I'd lived in for over 30 years had never felt like mine. Gulliver was the one who'd left his mark on the place, like a dog lifting up his leg to leave a scent trail, so that any other less dominant scents were expunged and overshadowed. I expect that is what had happened to mine. Slowly but surely I cautiously opened the trunk of my car, my heart now frisky with excitement about the prospect of living in this amazing place. If this cottage was as nice on the inside as it was on the outside, I'd be like a pig wrapped in clover. In a frenzy of eager enthusiasm, I began to bring in my suitcases, containing all my worldly goods, to the front door, where I carefully placed them on a small patio under the shelter of an overhanging green canvas awning that dipped over the front door in a generous arched canopy. I gingerly placed my suitcases one by one on the little patio and promptly returned to the trunk to collect my other luggage, which I began to pile outside the door. I was struck quite sadly how little I had to show for my life. Was this really all there was, that I had to show for 30 long years of marriage? It really was quite pitiful. But then again, material things did not define us, I reminded myself. That was when I saw her. I'm not sure how or why I noticed her, or if indeed it was by design that she wanted me to see her, but I knew that something was watching me, from the trees, about 100 yards away from the gurgling stream that weaved its way through the valley. She immediately got my attention. I stood up erect, as straight as a pencil, and surreptitiously scrutinized the entire woodgrove with my eyes. And that was when I saw a movement. A dark pyramid-shaped head mischievously peered at me from behind a rather gnarled-looking maple tree. I saw the flicker of dark eyes, the flash of black, the sizable silhouette of a distinctive Herculean figure. This thing was huge. It looked like a gargantuan human being, covered in long flowing licorice-coloured hair. I saw her so fleetingly, so quickly, that for a moment I almost thought I'd imagined it. Was that a Bigfoot, I wondered? In absolute awe. Surely not. I studied the trees again, but the lofty silhouette had gone. So I felt a measure of disappointment. I wanted to take a long, hard look at her. I wasn't scared, but fascinated, and I appreciated that this was indeed a very special moment that I would be unlikely to ever forget for as long as I lived, even if it had been so brief. I presumed the Bigfoot had been curious about a new arrival to the cottage that hadn't entertained a human life for a long while, apart from employing the services of a cleaner who came to the house once in a while. Seconds later I almost jumped out of my skin in astonishment. I was certain I heard a female voice directly in my head saying, "Welcome home! We've been expecting you. I'm glad you've finally come." My first thought was, where did that voice come from? I knew unequivocally this voice was not mine. So who had spoken to me? Was it the dark figure that I believed was a Bigfoot that had been watching me a moment ago? Could she have spoken to me in my head like that? Was that even possible? Surely not. I began to believe that my imagination was in overdrive, and that I had spoken those words to myself. Several months later, I was living in Mr. Riley's cottage, as happy as Paddington Bear would have been with his marmalade sandwiches. I had been thoroughly enjoying every minute of living in this mesmerizing place, with its rough textured white walls and sash windows. It had been kept meticulously clean over the years, by the cleaner Mr. Riley had employed. The cottage boasted valuable antiques and classic sumptuous furnishings that were both comfortable and incredibly stylish. Despite the cottage not being lived in for so long, there were no signs of mould anywhere, or mice burrowing into the furniture, or spiders setting up silken webs in the corners of rooms. The views over the stream were quite spectacular, both in the late afternoon and early in the morning, when the sun rose and set, a signature ball of tangerine fire, announcing the beginning and end of each day. I would sit on the wrap-around porch and watch the bird life and wild animals that came to the water to drink. And given the cottage was parked in the middle of an unspoiled wilderness, the untamed animals I saw were many, and were very varied, and they were plentiful as well, seemingly not to be afraid of my presence. Sadly, as yet, I had not seen the Bigfoot female again. It was so wonderful to be away from my toxic relationship with Gulliver, and I wondered privately why I had been so fearful of leaving him in the first place. I was like a caged bird that had been released into the wild and was learning to fly again, and it was so good to feel this free and unencumbered. I was now realizing that getting a divorce was the very best thing that had actually happened to me in my entire life, an unlikely blessing that had crowned my life with favour. My children were, of course, my greatest cheerleaders, urging me on all the way, as was Mr. Riley, who was resolutely determined now to leave me the cottage in his will, since I loved it so much. So even though I insisted it was far too generous on his part, inwardly I was going, yes, 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 because I had fallen so in love with the place, and it certainly felt like home to me. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else in the world.
"Well done, Mum. I don't know what to say to you," said my son Ralph. "I'm so incredibly proud of you. I've wanted you to divorce Dad for many years. It's the very best thing you've ever done, the wisest decision you've ever made, one that I know you will never ever regret."
Well, it was not like I had any choice in the matter, Rolf. Your dad spat me out, quite literally, to exchange me for a younger, prettier, slimmer and cleverer model. He's absolutely furious that I'm getting half of everything in the divorce settlement. He's stalling them at every juncture,
slowing the process down for reasons I just can't explain. He told the solicitors I don't deserve a bean of his hard-earned money, that I'm a fat, lazy, good-for-nothing slob. I think he told them I'd done sod all during our relationship and should be entitled to absolutely nothing. By all accounts, he's pissed over the whole stinking business, making a song and dance about everything. I'm not sure the solicitors enjoy dealing with him. He's been sending me threatening letters, of course, which I choose to ignore. He's warning me off accepting the money or else kind of thing. You know how your father can release a repertoire of idle threats just to get his way. That's a joke, Mum. You do deserve half of everything. You did so much for that man, and for us. Dad, he did nothing beyond bringing home his miserable paycheck, and ignoring his entire family, or beating us with that belt of his when he became incredibly mad. How is his relationship going with that Barbara Flores woman, by the way? I'm dying to know. I'd love to be a fly on the wall, see what's going on there. I bet you not everything is rosy in the garden. I wonder if they're still getting married after all this time, or has the woman finally worked out that he's a cad? Unfortunately, from what I gather, Barbara Flores is still very much in love with your father. She won't hear a bad word said against him. I understand she bought her wedding dress recently, and also the invitations to the wedding. And me and your father aren't even legally divorced yet. Talk about being premature. But that's your father for you, overly eager to get hitched to his perfect mannequin. I understand that the reception desk at Kenner's, where Barbara oversees the switchboard with Heidi Esterhuizen, I understand that reception desk is just covered with a plethora of wedding magazines. Heidi was the woman who warned me about your father's affair with Barbara Flores. She sent me a photograph recently of Barbara's late father. I nearly fainted from shock, let me tell you. Why would you do that? Asked Rolf incredulously. What's so special about her late father? Well, I don't know exactly how to tell you this, Rolf, but Barbara Flores's late father is identical to your father. They look like two peas in a pod. You can see that Barbara's father has a genuinely warm smile on his face that meets his eyes, while your father, well, he's grumpy, isn't he? He never smiles at all. But beyond that, they look pretty close to identical. They say everyone has a double, you know. Ah, that makes an awful lot of sense to me now. It sounds like Barbara Flores is trying to replace her father with our dad, especially as they look uncannily alike. There's a name for women fancying men that look like their fathers, isn't there? Yes, that's right. It's known as an Oedipus complex, I believe. It's what they call an aggressive attraction, usually to a parental figure of the opposite sex, and often happens in childhood. But yes, I think that Barbara Flores is trying to get her father back through your father, because of the physical likeness. It's extraordinary. Well, I hope for her sake she realizes our father is nothing like her father before she finally ties the knot with him. Believe me, Mum, she's going to be so miserable in that marriage. No woman deserves that. I hope you're right, Rolf. But I was possibly as naive and besotted by your father when I was her age too. I don't think that this young woman is going to see sense any time soon. I mean, Heidi works with her in reception and has become her very best friend. And if that girl can't talk her round, then I suspect nobody can. She's going to have to learn from her own mistakes. Look at me. I'm learning from mine. I had to be kicked out of my house by my own husband to realise it was the best thing that had actually happened to me. Sometimes mistakes can be like gifts, even if they're served up rather late in the day. Well, Mum, all I can say is I'm glad you're happy and that you're making friends in the local town. That is great news, it really is. I can't wait to come and visit you in Canada and to see this idyllic cottage of yours. I'll hold you to that, son, I said teasingly, closing the call. 3 nights later, a scream on my lips. I awoke suddenly, jerking in the chair, sending the book on my lap flying so that it was airborne for a brief second and went violently crashing to the floor with a loud, booming thud.
My trembling fingers began to dig into the plush armrest as I stared at the window, where I was greeted to the vacuous darkness of the outside world, staring right back at me. The living room was doused in the soft ethereal light of the lamp in the far corner of the room, that had thankfully stolen the dark shadows away, so that I could see everything in the dull, murky glow quite clearly. I was absolutely certain someone was at the window, looking in at me. Was I going completely mad? Of course I was. I mean, no one was there. It was probably just a raccoon scratching around outside or something. It was nothing to worry about. I was just being silly. Of course I was. Part of me wished I had the daring necessary to peek out of the window, to see if indeed there was anyone out there, but that would involve getting close and personal with the window pane, and I didn't fancy that. My fear undisputably screamed out, "No!" to me, as if I had that kind of bravery anyway, even though I told myself incessantly that nothing was actually there. I could not bring myself to look. I was cowardly, always had been, and I was intimidated by the darkness, so much so that even getting close to the window to rapidly draw the curtain seemed like a very bad idea. Instead, I scooped myself out of the chair and trudged hurriedly up the creaking staircase towards my bedroom. I always made absolutely sure that I had night lights distributed generously through the entire cottage, as staggering around awkwardly in the darkness, playing blind man's buff on my nocturnal trips to the kitchen and bathroom during the night, was not my idea of fun. My bed, in the far corner of the bedroom, beckoned to me invitingly. It was my safe harbour and retreat. The soft, tempting comforter seduced me, with its come-to-bed allure, and moments later I was lying in my bed, sinking comfortably into the luxurious Egyptian cotton sheets, halfway to heaven. I was quick to drift off to La-La Land, without any memory of how I actually got there. One moment I was lying in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, and the next thing I knew, I was sound asleep. All of a sudden I was jolted out of my sleep, like I had been downstairs in the living room moments before. The feeling was jolting and abrupt, almost as if someone had pushed me off a cliff. I sat up in bed with a start, wiping the sleep away from my bleary eyes, and that was when I heard it. I could hear pebbles being flung at my bedroom window. Now I was frightened. Someone was out there. I cautiously tipped over to the bedroom window with a surge of courage. Finally I reached the curtains that billowed slightly in the breeze, as yet more stones were flung against the glass pane, with an urgent pinging sound that I couldn't ignore. I quickly jerked back the curtain, peering out of the window. It was dark out there, but a moonlight broke through the ambiguous veil with an injection of pearly light. I could hear the distant sound of a car engine drifting away. Had I imagined that sound? There shouldn't be any cars on my property at this time of the night, but I was certain I'd heard a vehicle hurtling away at a speed, and that was when I saw her, caught up in the glow of the moonlight. It was the Bigfoot that I'd seen on my first day when I'd arrived at the property, and seeing her made me smile almost at once. I could see her so clearly now. She stood up on two powerful tree-trunk-sized legs. She was tall, lofty, and mighty in size and girth. Her yellow eyes looked like circles of fire that were intently focused on me. She was wildly oscillating her arms madly to get my attention. I knew she was trying to communicate with me in some way. What on earth was going on? What was she trying to tell me? Why did she seem so earnest? I leaned closer to the window pane, pressing my nose against it, and as my eyes met the Bigfoot's from a distance away, a voice was screaming in my head, "Fire! Fire! Fire! Get out of your house!" The Bigfoot was telling me there was a fire in my cottage, but how could that possibly be? I hadn't lit any candles. I was astonished. I hurriedly raced down the staircase, and that was when I realized that a couch in my living room, where I was formerly sitting, and was directly under my bedroom on the ground floor, had been set fully alight. The blazing hot fire was merrily leaping and crackling all over the settee, in bright, horrifying infernos of flames. The flames were quickly gaining height, and I realized that this was because there were wet patches on the walls that smelt of petrol. The fire billowed right up to the ceiling, with outstretched yellow fingers that were not remotely reticent in their demands, and seemed eager to break through the ceiling to reach my bed, so that in moments, had I been there, I would have lightly become a fireball. The discomposing thought rattled my emotions. I considered my dismal fate. Had I not woken up in the nick of time? I could smell the accelerant in the air. It was so strong. I knew this fire was no accident. I hurriedly dashed to the kitchen and grabbed the fire extinguisher, my heart pounding violently in my chest. I almost thought it would burst out of my skin like a tennis ball banging against a concrete wall. My fight and flight adrenal response marinated my bloodstream with a startling efficiency that I'd never owned before. My movements were swift, agile, and prompt. Before I knew it, the fire from the extinguisher had masterfully cut out the flames with its bountiful discharge of fire retardant, then anaesthetized the flames at once, so that a residual grey smoke plumed out of the scaffolding of the couch, resembling a charred human corpse, and the sides of the wall and the ceiling were completely black. I was hit with the horror that I could have died in this inferno. My throat was burning, it was dry and parched, the smell of hot smoke filling my lungs, so that I could almost barely breathe. I was gasping and spluttering and choking. The heat of the flames had singed my pyjamas that I was wearing. There were holes in the fabric, but luckily I had not got burned or remotely scathed. But a second too late, things could have been completely different. I bolted out of the front door like a rabbit from a burrow, and breathed in gasps of refreshing ice-cold air, falling to my knees as I hit the ground. Tears of relief and gratitude spilled down my cheeks. I tasted the salt on my tongue. I wondered why none of the smoke alarms had gone off in the cottage. I had checked that they'd all had batteries. Why had they enigmatically failed to work? The Bigfoot, on seeing me kneeling on the grass, ran hurriedly towards me, swinging her arms and legs as she moved with a flowing grace. Her former reticent evasiveness from when I first laid eyes on her, hiding behind a tree in the wood-grove, had been extinguished much like the fire. I noticed her bright yellow eyes were dappled with great concern. I spluttered out the words, "Thanks! You saved my life!" The Bigfoot stepped forward and began to smack my back lightly until my coughing subsided and my breathing calmed. I drank in deep gulps of oxygen-rich air, my eyes streaming from the grueling effects of the smoke. The Bigfoot suddenly dropped something at my feet, pointing towards the driveway, and then she said in a language that I did not understand, that translated miraculously itself into my head into English, "Kina kikwa, hila kilo, kila sinaswa." The bad man came. He's gone now. He set your house alight. I glanced down at the thing that the Bigfoot had dropped at my feet and studied it closely. What was it? It looked strangely familiar. I discovered I was holding a black and mustard leather glove in my hand. It was no ordinary glove. It was a glove from a pair of gloves that I'd brought my husband Gulliver as a birthday gift from a fine glove supplier in Switzerland. The gloves had been personally handcrafted and designed, and this one had been made exclusively for my husband. I had even selected the unique pattern that was one of a kind. What was it doing here on the ground? The Bigfoot answered my curious question, as if reading my mind. "Kila koloni pana, isa kila tolatakwi." A man was here, with murder in his heart. His energy was black, black, very black. Kila tilato, kisatolobana. I knew when I saw that energy, he wanted to harm you. Kilatina, posashikwa. So I followed him to watch what he was doing. Dinako, matilatila, kolabata. I saw him make a fire in the house. He kolopo. He ran away. So I threw stones at your window to get your attention. Kilani kolopo, isafosha. He dropped this thing, said the Bigfoot, pointing to the glove. With trembling fingers flapping nervously like a dove's wings, I studied the glove, caressing it between my fingers. I knew it belonged to my husband Gulliver, but what on earth was it doing here? It was in disbelief I comprehended the horrifying truth. Kilatika. Go well, said the Bigfoot. Kilani kolo. Shikasi. Polatinatwa. Litoloban. I'm watching over you. Do not be afraid. I will not let the bad man hurt you. She then nodded at me, gliding away, and I was left to piece the enigmatic puzzle together of what had transpired this night. I knew my husband Gulliver had absolutely no time for me these days. Not that he ever did, of course. Indeed, he seemed to actively despise me. It was a sure certainty he was not remotely happy I was getting half of the assets. Did he really hate me enough to want to obliterate me from the face of the earth, to kill me so savagely, in the grasp of a fire? I mean, he may not have been the nicest man in the entire world, but would he really want to harm me like this? As I stared at the glove that I'd bought Gulliver many years back on a trip to Switzerland, the evidence was undeniable, staring at me blazingly in my face. My husband had been here tonight. I knew he had this address, but he'd never been here before. And it was summer, but he'd worn gloves on this night, probably so that his fingerprints would not be found in the cottage, just as a precautionary measure, although I dare say he hoped that the whole place would go up in an inferno of flames, with me in it. The question was, how on earth did he get into the cottage to start the fire in the first place? I had locked all the doors. I was sure of that. I discovered the downstairs window had been yanked wide open, and a bar bent backwards, using some nifty tool, I expect. My husband must have climbed through the crawl space and got into the cottage this way. Was it in fact him who had been looking at me through the living-room window earlier on in the evening, jolting me rudely out of my sleep? When I suspected that someone was out there, it must have been him, I thought. I walked aimlessly around the cottage, my mind an absolute whirl, as I ruminated over that aftermath of what could have potentially happened to me had I not got out of the cottage in time. The couch in the living-room was smouldering, a carcass of what it had once been. I decided to check out all the smoke alarms. To my amazement, all the batteries were missing. They had been removed. And it really hit me like a bullet to the side of the head. My husband must have removed the batteries, while I remained obliviously fast asleep, so that I could not have been woken by a noisy alarm going off. He really had thought everything through meticulously and thoroughly, although I did wonder if the accelerant he had used could be traced after a fire by an investigating officer, as that could have got him into grievous trouble, if indeed the authorities thought it was arson, because he would likely be a number one suspect. He had surreptitiously driven to the cottage, and when I retired to bed had crawled through the window opening and worked out where I slept, setting the couch alight, throwing accelerant over the corner of the ceiling, as my bedroom was on top of that space on the upper floor. He had done this for one reason alone, to ensure that I died in that inferno, so that I would never get half of the divorce settlement, as when he sent his idle threats to me in the post, he had meant business. If I was out of the way, he'd get it all. I knew what I needed to do. The following morning I phoned up my husband, and he was so surprised, because I could tell by the tone of his voice, which revealed he certainly did not expect to be hearing from me, because he thought I'd be dead.
"Fiona,"
he said, sounding aghast.
"What's this about? Why are you phoning me? Anything we have to say to each other, you know, is directly through our solicitors. I thought I made that very clear."
"Oh, I just called you, Gulliver, to let you know that when you crept into my cottage last night, through the window that you happened to open, and the bar that you bent backwards, to set my couch alight in the living-room, so that you could bring down the whole cottage in flames just to kill me, you left your very expensive glove behind. You know, the one I designed for you, that I purchased you in Switzerland. There isn't a glove like it anywhere else in the world. Strange that it was found at my cottage, don't you think? Especially since you've never been here before." There was an uncomfortable, long, awkward silence at the end of the phone, and for a moment I thought that Gulliver had put it down. And then he piped,
"I don't know what you're talking about, Fee. You do speak such nonsense sometimes. he said defensively. What fire are you talking about? You're making no sense at all.
Cut the innocent out, Gulliver. Just so you know, I've written letters to people of prominence to keep in safety that are to be opened should I die in unusual circumstances, so that the police will know that you are directly behind any suspicious death. I have the evidence in the glove you left behind, Gulliver, and you and I well know that there is unlikely to be any other glove in the world quite like this one. I know you were here last night. Deny it all you like, but I've even got a camera. The second part of my claim was of course an absolute lie, because I had no camera in the cottage, but it didn't hurt my husband to believe that I actually did.
You have a camera? He said, sounding horrified. I'm sorry, Fiona. All right. Please don't go to the police. I don't know what I was doing, but I did not want to kill you. I just wanted to scare you, that's all. It wasn't a big deal. You're overreacting as usual.
Not a big deal! Are you kidding me, Gulliver? You could have killed me. From where I'm standing, it's a very big deal indeed. Unfortunately for you, your duplicitous plan went up in smoke, but you might have been under a cloud of suspicion if the fire was considered to be arson. But let's cut to the chase here. You wanted me dead, Gulliver. You know it, and I know it, so that you could get your grubby little hands onto all our assets. I should be going straight to the police. Any normal woman would be doing just that, and getting you arrested and locked away for good, because you know what? That's exactly what you deserve. But I'm a better person than you are, Gulliver. I'm also forgiving, and I don't hold on to my grievances. Don't you dare try the stupid stunt again, or you will go down for murder, and that's a promise.
Fiona, I'm telling you, I started the fire so you would take me seriously about the divorce settlement. You're getting far too much. But I wasn't planning to kill you. That was the last thing on my mind. I knew you'd get out of the cottage in time.
I'd love to believe you, Gulliver, but I don't. And what about the empty batteries in my smoke alarms? Those batteries were working perfectly, and now they're removed. Now try and explain that one to me. Just so you know, if you continue to contest the divorce settlement, I will go to the police, do you understand? So you better get on to your solicitors right away and sort this dreadful mess out, because I cannot get divorced from you fast enough. You may wonder why I didn't go to the police and get Gulliver arrested. I know I should, but I just couldn't do it. Even so, I'm not exactly sure why. I guess I'd been married to the man for so long that I didn't want him to be locked away indefinitely, although I agree he deserved it in every sense of the word. But he was still the father of my children, and I had been married to him for a long time, and even if things had not been rosy in the garden, we had a history together, and that counted for something as far as I was concerned. I'd never been the vengeful type, and despite what Gulliver did to me, I never hated him in the way he despised me, and I never could. Gulliver must have been very scared by my threat, worried that I might capriciously change my mind and go to the police and finally have him arrested, as later that day I got a call from a very confounded solicitor, affirming to me that my difficult belligerent husband had finally agreed to all the settlements, which of course was a huge relief. It meant things would go through smoothly from now on. Furthermore, Gulliver sent someone to fix and repair up the damage in my cottage, to replace the ceilings and one of the walls, and of course the sofa. But I think that was done to cover his back, as he was running scared. I couldn't wait for the divorce to be finalized, and to put this wretched business all behind me. I wanted Gulliver out of my life for good, and Barbara, whoever she was welcome to him. The strangest thing of all is after I left my husband, I didn't go on a diet or exercise program, and yet the extra 40 pounds I had put on during the course of my marriage melted away like candle wax, without any effort on my part. How was it even possible? I hadn't even tried to consciously lose this weight, and yet it had slipped off me so effortlessly, like Cinderella's glass slipper. It was now that I was free to be myself, had let go of my inhibitions, insecurities, and with it the excess weight. For the first time the face that stared back at me in the bathroom mirror that I could not bear to look at in the past, did not look so bad any more. I was beginning to like the new me, because I was more confident and assertive, and no longer the pushover I had been for so long. Later that morning, after the fiasco of the previous night, I could see a man in his 50s, not much older than myself, with a full head of grey hair, running up my driveway. He appeared to be out of breath and rather white in the face. He seemed disorientated and confused. I realized the stranger needed my help, but there was something distinctive about him that I appeared to recognize, like when I'd seen Heidi Esterhazing when she sashayed up to my front door, and I knew her from somewhere, but I didn't know where. I was getting the same impression from this man. The way he carried himself, those steely grey eyes that looked at me, the distinctive nose. But who was he? I was certain I'd met him. But I quickly persuaded myself the idea was simply ridiculous. The world wasn't this small, surely. Hugh Pearson's account.
It had been very dark, driving down some of those ambiguously obscure back-country roads, let me tell you. But I was in a very bad way. I had to get away, deep into the heart of the rolling countryside. I needed to get away from it all, and driving around at night seemed like a way to deal with the hopelessness that had been consuming me. For some reason, driving has always been tranquilizing for me. I'd never been bothered about driving at night, even in a place where there were no street lights on offer, and everything was covered in a velvety black veil. None of that ever bothered me. Perhaps even the tenebrific landscape in some way offered me solace. I can't be sure about that. Who knows? But getting into the heart of the countryside, far away from that horrible hospital, seemed like a very good idea to me. I was recklessly slamming my hands rather brutally on the steering wheel, so incredibly hard that I was doing myself some damage, but I didn't care. I was screaming, "It's not bloody fair, God! Why did you take Thomas away? What did he ever do to you? Why do you always go after the good people? Thomas was one of the nicest people you could ever hope to meet. But no, you decided to take him away. Why would you do this? Why not take someone else?" I was angry with God and the universe, even though I'd never been a man of faith. But it was good to put the blame on someone else, and God would do very nicely indeed. I screamed out a whole lot of obscenities into the night. I'm not proud of myself. I wasn't inclined to use bad language by any manner of means, but I was hemorrhaging swear words that were so vile they'd make a sailor blush. But I didn't care. Why should I care about anything any more? I had never really lost someone close to me. Both my parents were very much alive. Knowing I'd never see Thomas again was too much to bear for me. I almost felt like driving into a tree and being done with everything, so the pain would finally be gone. I cannot remember the last time I cried, but tears were pouring unabashedly down my cheeks, blurring my vision, as my rubber tires grazed the windy contours of the sequestered country roads. In truth, I had no way of knowing where on earth I was going. I had left my cell phone behind at the hospital, on the side table next to Thomas's bed. So unfortunately I had no GPS reception to help me navigate my way through this labyrinth of forested roads. Moments before I'd been in the hospital room talking and laughing with Thomas, as we knew he had about a week left to live. We wanted to make the most of the time he had left, but it had run out far too fast. No one had been expecting this to happen. There had been no warning signs that you normally see in the dying process. When the person slips into oblivion, their skin goes blue, and their breathing begins to resemble a rattle. There had been none of that. Thomas's skin had been pale, and he'd eaten a good dinner. He'd laughed at one of the pathetic jokes I had uttered. "You're funny, bro. You do know how to make me laugh, like no one else I know." He slurred his words and said something that was barely audible, and then he was gone, just like that. I'd screamed for the nurse. "Nurse! Nurse! Get here quickly! My friend's not breathing! Do something, for God's sake! Do something!" The nurse had rushed to Thomas's side, feeling for his pulse. "I'm sorry," she said, looking up at me, "but he's gone." "No!" I screamed. "No!" I threw my hands on top of my head. "No! You've got to do something! Get him back now! He's not supposed to go! Resuscitate him, for God's sake! Don't just stand there doing nothing!" "Sir, I know this is desperately upsetting, and I'm very, very sorry for your loss. But you need to calm down. Your friend was dying. You knew that. Everybody knew that here. I'm afraid resuscitation could never have worked on him. He's gone a few days prematurely, earlier than we expected, but he's gone. I know it's hard. Death is a part of life. It happens to us all at some point, but let me call someone to be with you. You're in a dreadful, dreadful state. It's not good for you to be on your own like this. I can send a counsellor to talk to you if you like. They can help talk to you, maybe prescribe some sedatives for you to help you manage your grief." "I don't want anyone, nor do I want anything, and I certainly don't need any sedatives. Leave me alone, will you? Stop being so damn nice, overly sweet, so syrupy. Don't you get it? My best friend was not supposed to die today. We were told he still had days to live. They lied to me. We were talking and then—" I know, said the nurse, nodding her head. She reached out to console me with a gentle hand, which I pushed away. "I know he wasn't expected to go right now," she said kindly. "There's normally a little advance warning, but sometimes it happens like that. The body doesn't always behave the way we expect. Sometimes it can take us off guard. But I think you were lucky, I really do. He died talking to you like that. Some people are in a coma when they pass. But you spoke to him till the very end. I mean, that's got to be a good thing, surely." "Lucky? How can you say I'm lucky? My best friend is dead. Do you even know what you're saying, woman?" "Sir, I know it's hard. I really do. I tell you what, let me get you a sweet drink from the dispenser. A can of sweet Coca-Cola, perhaps. It'll do you a great deal of good. You need the sugar, I'm sure, to give you energy." "I don't want anything to give me energy. And I don't need anything for energy. I have so much energy, in fact, that I could bring this whole hospital down. That's how mad I feel," I said, storming out of the hospital room like a rampaging rhino, while the nurse ran after me, her face contorted with concern. Sir, I just don't think you should go. Not like this. Not in this state. If you don't mind my saying so, you're not fit enough to drive in your condition. If you like, I can call a taxi for you to take you home, but I don't recommend you drive." "Leave me alone," I practically shrieked, barreling past her, blinded by my own tears. I barely remember getting into my truck, but I managed to do so. I kept driving and driving and driving. I didn't even know where I was going, but the driving was oddly soothing to me. It was good to focus on something else beyond my grief. I felt angry, so cheated. I was supposed to have a few more days with my friend, and that had been denied me. Of course, I had been prepared for his death. Thomas had been ill for 3 long years. I guess I was in denial. Even though he had been ill, we had thoroughly enjoyed many good times together, done so many things, ticked so many things off the bucket list. I suppose, despite everything, I persuaded myself that his death was never going to happen. The only person I was deluding was myself. I will never forget when Thomas was first diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I was much more upset than he was. He took the very unkind revelations with a pinch of salt, as if it was no big deal, and I rarely admired him for his stoic courage. He approached his cancer with an extraordinary grace. Never once did he complain or feel sorry for himself, or even feel he'd been cheated. He was accepting from the very beginning. It all began when Thomas began to experience throbbing headaches, and moments when his vision became blurred and cloudy, so much so he could barely see anything at all. He would also experience frequent blackouts, His first port of call was to see an eye specialist, and from then on it spiraled down a rather unfortunate slippery slope. I remember when he called me to tell me that he had multiple malignant tumours in his brain and would require an operation and chemotherapy. I was devastated by the news. One of the tumours could have killed him in days had it not been removed. The treatments he received for his brain cancer prolonged his life to a degree. But one day over a pizza at a local restaurant, Thomas told me he was dying, and when he said that, I couldn't take another bite. My stomach was in knots. There's nothing they can do. The cancer is terminal. They say I've got a month to live. What? I said. That cannot be right. It can't be right. There has to be something they can do. Thomas reached out to me with a sobering hand. Look, bro, you've been like a brother to me. You're my very best friend. I know it's hard to hear my news, but I'm okay with it. Really I am. I'm just going on another intrepid journey. They say when you get to the other side, you never want to come back because it's so good. I've heard that, I admitted. They say they're colours you don't even get here, that everything is perfect. But I'm not ready for you to go, bro. There is still so much I hoped we could do together. The timing really sucks. It is a bummer. I know, said Thomas, but I'm at peace with it, bro. And you need to be too, for my sake at least. As I was driving somewhat precariously in my truck, deeper and deeper into the heart of the countryside, I was struck with the extreme unfairness of it all. Why was life so damn cruel? I hadn't prepared to lose my best friend this quickly. I thought I had a whole week left to enjoy his company before he breathed his very last. I felt that the universe had dealt me a double blow, and I was furious because I'd been cheated. If my friend had died when I expected him to go, that I could have coped with, but losing a few invaluable precious days that I expected to have made me furiously enraged. I hadn't even said a proper goodbye to Thomas, and now he was gone, having died prematurely, and was never coming back. We had been so close from when we were kids. We had lived in exactly the same street, done everything together. We got divorced at the same time, and that made our relationship stronger as friends. We had been bonded over our grief, of relationships that we could not save, like a drowning child that can't be revived. With a sudden abrupt surge of incorrigible anger, I promptly parked my car on the side of the sequestered road in the middle of nowhere, and got out, slamming the door behind me, charging towards the trees. It was a cool night. A wind blew briskly against my skin. I didn't have a flashlight with me, and if I had one, I would have not removed it from my car. I didn't care. I was flooded with the adrenaline of an all-consuming rage, and I had never been the type to get angry easily. So these raw, incongruous emotions I knew not how to handle, as they were so new to me. I did not know how to relieve myself of the tsunami of grief inside me that was burdening my heart and making my insides vacuously empty. I found a narrow footpath through the trees, and thankfully a magnanimous moonlight spilled through the branches, so I could see my way clearly down the trail. I thundered rather erratically down the footpath, rudely and rather brusquely stamping the ground like an insolent, precocious child having a hissy fit. I fiercely kicked the trunks of the trees, some that reached out to scratch me with overhanging branches that I had failed to see, that knifed through my skin and drew blood. I never felt any pain, but embraced every scratch. It brought me relief, as I slammed my way through the grove, cursing under my breath, and spilling out a plethora of verbal diarrhea, as my anger was very, very out of control. Whether the trees were offended by me, I cannot be sure. All of a sudden, I became conspicuously well aware that I was almost certainly not alone in these woods, as dark as they were. Someone was watching me, and I had an audience. Then I saw her, and nothing prepared me for what I was seeing. She stopped ahead of me in the footpath, as if she had been expecting me. She was not remotely evasive, nor reticent, but commanding of my complete attention. If there was anything I do know for sure, she wanted me to see her, for she was no shrinking violet. She was confident and self-assured, standing up proudly with a lofty deportment, with a back as straight as a pencil, and a posture so graceful it took my breath away. I stopped short in my tracks. My mouth dropped open in astonishment. My body began to tremble and shake like a leaf. Nothing prepared me for what I was seeing. I had to be hallucinating, surely. My grief must be playing tricks with my mind. I knew, of course, that this was absolutely not the case. I was staring at a female Bigfoot. She might have been 8 foot tall, possibly more. But she was gargantuan in size, covered in long flowing dark hair. Of what exact colour I cannot be sure. And she had a face that reminded me of a high-ranking Indian warrior. Indeed, a headdress of eagle's feathers would have looked rather becoming on her human face, with its leathery skin and heavily frowned forehead. Her nose was flat, almost as if it had been squashed against a window pane. But her deep-set dark eyes were intelligent and bright, full of spirited energy. I should have been intimidated, lightly running away in terror, and if I'd had my wits about me, I would have done just that. But I didn't care about anything right now. The way I felt was that if the Bigfoot finished me off, she'd be doing me a favour. All well and good. Then I could join my friend in the hereafter. I found myself staring into the Bigfoot's mesmerizingly beautiful dark eyes. I was just drawn to them, in ways I cannot explain. I was struck with how incredibly kind they were. And what happened next was more bewildering than ever, because the Bigfoot spoke to me in my head, in a voice that was both kind and warm, almost angelic, you could say.
You'll find your happiness again. Your friend is with you right now. He's telling me that he's sorry to have left so soon, but he will come and get you one day, when your time has come. He says to tell you that it's beautiful where he is.
I couldn't believe the Bigfoot was saying this to me, in some weird form of telepathic exchange. But I have no idea what happened after that, because later on I woke up in the woodgrove, lying under a tree, with the light of the new morning spilling through the branches. I sat up with quite the start, as you can imagine, feeling completely confused and disorientated. I mean, had I really slept in the woodgrove all night? It seemed nonsensical to me. What time was it? I could hear the tweets of the birds high up in the trees above my head, and I glanced around at the verdant foliage and undergrowth, and felt as if I was in a subterranean oasis. Everything was beautiful, of course. Then I remembered the Bigfoot I'd seen. Had I dreamt her? I wondered. It had felt so incredibly surreal. But when I looked down at the earthen pathway, I saw a huge imprint in the ground that confirmed to me that my encounter last night had not been fictitious. I wondered if the creature had left it there to affirm just that to me, in case I doubted my encounter with her. I reflected what she had told me, and that my friend Thomas had apologized for leaving early, and her words brought me immeasurable comfort. What I did not understand, however, was how or why I had clearly blacked out after my encounter with that Bigfoot. How had that happened? People didn't just pass out in the woods during the night, did they? I promptly got to my feet, brushing away the debris of grass and leaves off my clothes. Thank goodness it hadn't been too cold last night. It had been rather warm. Now I needed to find my car, but where on earth was it? I sashayed through the woodgrove and found the road where I'd parked it, but I realized it was gone. Where was it? It couldn't have just disappeared into thin air like this. Even though I had been in an angry stupor, I knew where I had parked it, and I'd parked it next to the tree with the burgeoning vines growing all over it, strangling it half to death. Let's just say it was nowhere to be found. So I knew I needed help, and I had no idea where I was going to find it, because I was in the middle of nowhere. There didn't seem to be any human habitation around. The nearest farmhouse could be miles away for all I knew. And that was when I noticed a tiny, narrow opening in the trees. And so I followed it, grateful to see that it led down some kind of driveway of sorts. I was relieved to see a distant, very beautiful-looking cottage overlooking a stream set up against a hilly backdrop. And as I ran up the path, a woman of around about my age was standing there looking at me. But then I recognized her at once. Oh, my God! I hadn't seen Fiona Edward Grant in what seemed like 100 years or so. She was the girl that got away when we left school, and I went away to college in Canada. After that, I never saw her again. But she'd been my first love. What were the chances of seeing her after all these years? And what was she doing here in Canada, more to the point? Was she married, I wondered? Would she even recognize me? Had I changed too much? My dark hair was now completely grey, that I would admit, and a lot thinner than it used to be. I had some fine lines creeping around my face, especially around the eye area. I stared at the woman, feeling a little flutter in my heart that I had not felt for a long, long time. Fiona came dashing towards me, obviously sensing my disorientation. I don't think she was too comfortable with the gog-eyed way I appeared to be looking at her. "Hello," she said in the voice that I'd always remembered from years before. That beautiful, beautiful voice that I knew I would never forget, especially when I heard it again. "Do you need any help? If you don't mind my saying, you look terribly confused. Are you lost or something?" I cleared my throat. I was a wee bit disappointed, I'm not going to deny that. Fiona obviously didn't recognize me at all. Had I changed so much, beyond all recognition? I probably had. "I know it sounds odd, really odd," I said to her, "but I've lost my car. I can't find it anywhere. I went for a walk in the woods, and when I returned to my car, it was gone, vanished into thin air just like that, and I know exactly where I parked it." "You've lost your car?" said Fiona, looking rather confounded. The puzzle lines on her forehead appeared to deepen. "How can you lose a car? It's a very big thing to lose, especially around here, when I imagined it would be quite conspicuous. Do you remember where you parked it? A lot of roads around here look similar, with all the trees around them. You could be slightly confused as to where you did actually park it." "I made sure when I parked it that I would know where it was. I parked it next to a tree that was being strangled by vines. But I don't know why I can't find it anywhere. I do not have a cell phone on me. I need to get a lift back to my house to call my neighbour, so I can come back with him and look for that car of mine. It has to be somewhere around here. It's chosen to do a vanishing act on me. Do you mind desperately if I use your phone?" "Of course I don't mind," said Fiona, smiling at me warmly. "You better come in. You poor thing. You must feel quite stranded out here." She paused for a moment and looked at me directly in my eyes. "I know this sounds crazy," she said to me, looking at me curiously again. "But you look rather familiar. Why do I feel like I know you from somewhere?" "Oh, my goodness," I was thinking. "Thank goodness she recognizes me, just a little." "I think it's because you do know me," I announced. "We went to high school together in Vermont. You're Fiona Edward Grant, are you not? You and we were together at one point. Besides, I never forget a pretty face, especially not yours. I recognized you at once." "Oh, my God, it is you!" said Fiona, gasping. "Hugh Pearson! I'd never believe that in a month of Sundays, but it's you! I knew you." "Well, it's me," I said, giving her a wicked grin. "I've thought of you a lot over the years, Fiona. You were the girl that got away. You're not married, are you?" I asked, holding my breath. This woman was so beautiful. Could I dare to hope that she was not married? Women like her had to be saddled with a husband and kids. Her being single, no, that would be too good to be true.
I am married, as it happens. My surname's von Rennen now.
Oh, I see, I said, feeling disappointment rising up in me. So you're living here in Canada with your husband, in this beautiful cottage? What brings you to Canada of all places? I know you have Canadian heritage, but I never thought you'd live out here.
My divorce, said Fiona.
The words were like music to my ears. I tried to sound sympathetic, even though I wanted to scream to the rooftops with delight. Inwardly I was going, yes, yes, yes. The one that got away is getting divorced.
And you?
Asked Fiona.
Are you married?
I'm unfortunately not. I got divorced about 7 years ago. It was terribly messy. A very unfortunate business, but it is what it is.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's a bummer. I know, because I'm going through a divorce now.
Do you mind dreadfully telling me why you're getting divorced? Or just tell me to mind my own business? I asked coyly. Fiona shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. You know. According to my husband, I'm boring, ugly, fat, stupid, the whole thing. At that, I cracked up laughing.
What's so funny?
I'm laughing because your soon-to-be ex-husband is a complete idiot. You're the most beautiful woman in the entire world as far as I'm concerned. I've thought about you a lot over the years, and I thought, why did I ever let that girl slip through my fingers like grease? And now here you are.
A little battle-weary, perhaps, and certainly older. But yes, here I am.
All of a sudden, I was staring at Fiona's carport, my mouth dropping open in astonishment.
What's wrong?
Asked Fiona.
You look like you've seen a ghost.
Well, I think I might just have. What on earth is my Jeep Wrangler doing under that tree over there? Fiona swiveled her gaze towards the tree, and she looked very surprised when she saw my vehicle parked underneath it.
What the hell? What is that doing there? This is not what you think. I'm not in the habit of stealing people's cars.
We both walked side by side to my Jeep, and in the front seat of my car were my keys, a collection of small stones. And then I knew exactly who'd brought the car here. It must have been the female Bigfoot, because she was so big she could have carried anything. Was she trying to play matchmaker, I wondered? And what a matchmaker she was! Fiona was the perfect woman. She ticked all the right boxes for me. And what were the chances of running into her again after all these years? It was a miracle of note, that was for sure, and I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. 2 years later, I'm holding my new wife's hand in a supermarket in Vermont. I'd never been happier, of course. I got married to the girl that got away. I missed Thomas, of course I did. But I had found a new best friend in Fiona. We had come to Vermont together to visit my parents who lived here. Fiona was looking at the vegetables. She wanted to cook my parents a casserole for dinner. All of a sudden a man walked over towards us, with a gaping mouth. I realized he was looking at my wife with an incredulous expression on his face, as if he'd seen a ghost. My wife's face went completely white.
Oh, hello, Gulliver. Fancy seeing you here. How are you doing? Long time no see.
More to the point, what are you doing here in Vermont? I thought you were in Canada. Fiona pointed to me.
This is my husband Hugh, she said.
Pleased to meet you, said Gulliver, shaking my hand rather icily, and practically glaring at me in the process. He wasn't pleased to see me at all.
Well, we're here to see Hugh's parents. You see, Hugh grew up in Vermont. We were at high school together. I seem to remember telling you he was my first love. We're back together again. You know, we got married and everything.
So you rekindled your friendship, did you? Said Gulliver sarcastically. How very cosy. You're looking very good these days, Fiona. You've lost all the weight. Your hair's very nice. Your dress pretty. Seems to me your standards have gone up in the world.
That's nice of you to say, Gulliver,
said Fiona.
I'll take that as a compliment. How's your relationship with Barbara Flores these days? Did the two of you get married?
No, we didn't get married, said Gulliver. And I'm very glad about that too. Awful girl she was. Can you believe it? She says I was too old for her. But then again, she was so callow, so damn babyish, always whining about this and that. I'm glad we never tied the knot. It would never have worked.
I'm sorry to hear that, Gulliver. That is a bit disappointing.
Well, I better be going, said Gulliver, grumbling under his breath. Good to see you, Fiona. Once he was gone, Fiona looked at me sadly.
He looks like a lonely, miserable old man. And he didn't even ask about the children. You'd think he'd want to know about his own kids. He's cut himself off from everyone. I feel sorry for him, I really do. He looks such a mess.
Well, sorry, love, but he got what he deserved, I said, kissing my beautiful wife on the cheek. I'm the one that won the gold, because I've got you.
So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. And wow, so many dimensions to it. I mean, who would have thought those two would get together? Wasn't it wonderful that a woman who was treated so badly by her husband, had such a miserable time with him, put up with him for so long, ends up meeting her first love again in such idiosyncratic circumstances that you never saw coming, and having an encounter with a Bigfoot that brought those two together in some way? There was definitely some dynamics going on there that are beyond our comprehension. What an extraordinary story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.